Section 5, Chapter 3, The Author's Introspections. In the preceding chapter, we asked, what is it that determines the horse's movements? Independent thinking or external signs? We found that it was solely external signs, which we described as certain postures and movements of the questioner. Beyond a doubt, these necessary signs were given involuntarily by all the persons involved, and without any knowledge on their part that they were giving any such signs. This is to be seen from their statements, which cannot be cavilled at, as well as from the fact that several of them even today still doubt the correctness of the explanation which we are here offering. I myself for some time made these involuntary movements quite unwittingly, and even after I had discovered the nature of these movements, and had thus become enabled to call forth at will all the various responses on the part of the horse, I still succeeded in giving the signs in the earlier naive, involuntary manner. It is not easy, to be sure, to eliminate at once the influence of knowledge, and to focus attention with the greatest amount of concentration on the number desired, rather than upon the movement which leads to a successful reaction on the part of the horse. To some this may appear impossible, but those who are accustomed to do work in psychological experimentation will not deny the possibility of such exclusive concentration upon certain ideas. If we now ask, what occurred in the mind of the questioners while they were giving the signs? The answer can be found only by way of the process which in psychology is technically called introspection, i.e. observation of self. In the following we will give the most important results of this process of self-observation, which took place in the same period in which the observations recorded in the preceding chapter were made. My first experiments were made while the horse was counting or solving arithmetical problems, and were as follows. Mr. Shillings, who was alone with me in the horse's barn, asked me to think of several numbers, maintaining that the horse would be able to indicate them correctly upon being asked. He stood to the right of the horse, I stood erect and at the side of Mr. Shillings. There was no one else present. Somewhat sceptical in attitude, I concentrated my mind consecutively on 5 small numbers. Hans tapped one of them incorrectly, 1 correctly, and 3 by 1 unit too many. At the time I considered these attempts as unsuccessful, and credited some curious chance with the answers which were correct or nearly so. This was a mistake, for often during the following days, and in the absence of Mr. von Osten, the horse would give correct answers. Others, of course, would be incorrect, and usually the mistakes would be by 1 unit, so that I soon saw that even in the horse's errors there lay some system. It will be seen that Hans responded to me from the very beginning, undoubtedly because I had the opportunity of watching Mr. von Osten and Mr. Shillings, and had thus patterned my behaviour after theirs. I was not at first successful in getting the horse to respond correctly in the case of large numbers, for in order to get complete control over the horse, and what was, as I later discovered, more to the point, control of myself, some practice was needed. But I was able to work with the horse quite successfully, while I was still in the dark as to my own behaviour. From the very beginning, Hans responded as promptly to those questions which I articulated merely inwardly as to those which were spoken aloud. That all formulation of the question was unnecessary, however, was shown by the following experiments. If, for example, I did not think of any particular number until the horse had begun to tap, then fixed upon 5, he would tap 5. If, however, I told him to count to 6, but gave no further thought to the command after he had begun tapping, I would get an entirely wrong answer. It was easy to obtain any answer one wished to a question, simply by focusing consciousness with a great degree of intensity upon the answer desired. Thus, Hans answered my question, how many angles has a hexagon? First by 6, then 2, then 27, in accordance with the numbers that came into my mind. The animal always followed the ideas which were in the questioner's mind, and never his words, for it was with the former that the movements upon which the horse depended were bound up. It was not enough, however, to simply imagine the number desired. It was furthermore necessary that the questioner be conscious of the movement when the horse reached that number. Larger numbers, above 6, were therefore successful only when every single tap was inwardly counted to the end. The manner of counting was indifferent. Thus, I counted 6 as follows: 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and later 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and then again 6, 6, 6, 6, 6, 6. Finally, I used the Greek letters and also nonsense syllables, and in all cases I obtained 6 taps, the correct response. If, however, I simply counted the taps without knowing when the desired number was reached, the responses were always incorrect. E.g., I counted for number 10, 10, 10, 10 continuously, hence tapped 13. For number 10, 1, 2, 3 to 10, hence tapped 10. For number 12, 12, 12, 12 continuously, hence tapped 15. For number 12, 1, 2, 3 to 12, hence tapped 12. In the case of smaller numbers, on the other hand, one often obtained correct responses without counting. In this I am borne out by Mr. Schillings. It was merely necessary to imagine vividly the number 3 or 4, or even the name of a weekday or of a month without the number which would indicate it. In the last of these cases, the number corresponding to the day or the month, e.g. 3 for Tuesday, 5 for May, etc., though not consciously presented, still evidently lay at hand in the subconscious. To use a popular expression, I usually had a feeling when Hans had arrived at the right number. It was furthermore found that it was not only necessary to count to, or to think of, the number desired, but that this must take place with a high degree of tension of expectancy, that is, a strong affective element must enter in. The state required for a successful response was not the mere passive expectation that the horse would tap the number demanded of him, nor the wish that he might tap it, but rather the determination that he should do it. An inward "thou shalt," as it were, was spoken to the horse. This affective state was registered in consciousness in terms of sensation of tension in the musculature of the head and neck by intra-organic sensations, and finally by a steadily rising feeling of unpleasantness. When the final number was reached, the tension would suddenly be released and a curious feeling of relaxation would ensue. I have made a series of tests to determine the most favourable degree of tension in expectation. It was possible to distinguish with certainty 3 degrees of tension besides the state of utter relaxation, all of which I measured by the means of the differences in the sensations of tension. In cases of tension of the first degree, greatest concentration, the responses were usually correct. A few, however, were lacking by 1 unit. There was therefore in the latter instance a premature release of inattention. In cases of tension of the second degree, all answers were correct except a very few which were too great by 1 unit. In cases of tension of the third degree, many answers were wrong, and usually by several units too many. I wished to have the horse tap 10 with the lowest degree of concentration. He tapped 13, then in a repetition of the test, 12. I thereupon increased the tension, Hans then tapped 8. I decreased the tension once more, but so that it was somewhat greater than at first. Hans tapped 10 correctly. At another time I tried to have him tap the number 5 with a low degree of tension. He tapped 6. I intensified expectation, and Hans tapped 4. I again decreased it, and he tapped 5, comme il faut. Apparently, therefore, the most favourable degree of tension was one between the first and second, the latter being the least favourable. After some practice, a lesser degree than was used in the beginning sufficed to evoke adequate reactions. The flow of nervous energy to the motor centres of the brain evidently became facilitated through practice. It will be easy to understand why the first days of experimentation caused intense headaches, which later never occurred. Whenever, in the foregoing, we spoke of a certain degree of concentration which had to be attained, it is not to be understood that the same tension had to be maintained throughout the test, from the horse's first tap to his last, but rather that it began with a low degree, and gradually increased as the final unit of the count was being approached. It may best be represented by a curve whose maximum represents that degree of tension which we have been discussing. The rise to this maximum, which, when attained, was followed by a sudden fall, did not always occur in the same manner. Three types of curve may be distinguished, which were first discovered in purely empirical fashion, and later reproduced voluntarily for purposes of experimentation by diagramming before each test the intricate curve of the varying degrees which the intensity of concentration was to assume. The types may be described as follows. 1. Here the tension curve rises steadily from beginning to end. This type preponderates in the case of small numbers. Thus, when I asked the horse, "How much is 2 plus 4?" the tension increased slowly with every tap from the moment I began counting until the final tap was reached, when it was again relaxed. Externally, this relaxation is noticeable as a slight jerk. 2. In this case, the curve does not rise at an equal rate, but rather more slowly at the beginning and later undergoes a sudden increase, or the tension increases immediately at the beginning, remains constant for some time, and then ascends to the maximum. This curve is the rule in the case of large numbers, and evidently means economy of physical energy, for experience soon taught that a steady increase in tension from the very beginning soon brought it to a level which cannot be long maintained, and usually leads to a premature relaxation. In the case of very large numbers, the alternation of the slight and the sudden increase may be repeated several times, and at times it may even sink below a level which has already been attained, thus making a wave-like curve. 3. The third type of curve shows a sudden jump between two units at a certain point in its course. This may occur in the case of both small and large numbers, but only when the highest or first degree of concentration is employed. See page 91. Such a jump frequently occurs in the transition from the tap preceding the last to the last one which is being eagerly expected. Relaxation, with the upward jerk and raising of the head, here occurs at the normal time. Hence taps to the end with his right foot. Oftener still, the jump described occurs while passing over to the number just before the last. The goal seems within reach and the mental tension relaxes, and with it the physical tension. The head gives a slight jerk, and Hans makes the back step. Since, however, another tap is still awaited with some degree of tenseness, and since complete erection of the head does not follow immediately upon the jerk of the head, the horse gives another tap with the left foot. Thereupon occurs the complete relaxation of attention and the assumption of the erect posture on the part of the questioner. That this is psychologically the clue which leads to the final tap will readily appear from the following remarkable fact. I was able to bring about at will either the back step with the right foot or the additional extra tap with the left foot by concentrating the mind either upon the last unit or upon the one just preceding it. In either case, the movement which served as stimulus to the horse followed naturally upon concentration on the number. I could, of course, also control the response by direct voluntary control of the movements involved. Hans thus solved for me the same 10 problems first with the back step, then with the extra final tap. Finally, we will indicate the one true inner cause of the difficulty in getting the number 1 as a response. It is not easy to relax attention immediately after having just begun to concentrate. Relaxation, therefore, often occurs with a certain retardation, and the result is a belated jerk of the head. Briefly, I would also mention a few of the more interesting introspective observations which were made in situations in which the horse responded with movements of the head for answers such as yes and no, up and down, etc. From the very beginning I put questions to Hans which would have to be answered by a shake of the head. It often happened that instead of indicating 0, Hans would begin tapping some number, but the wonder of it was that, in many cases, he responded properly. I knew only that I inwardly pronounced the word null, 0, and that I looked expectantly at the horse's head. In the case of questions to which I expected the answer yes or no, I imagined myself enunciating the answers, i.e. I used motor imagery. The tests failed the moment I employed only visual or auditory imagery, whereas motor imagery was always effective in calling forth correct responses. Footnotes. Thus, it is possible to think of the word no in 3 different ways. I may get a visual image of the written or printed word, or the auditory image of the word as spoken by another person, or finally I might think of it in terms of images of the sensation of movement which would arise if I myself were to enunciate or write the word. And so, in like manner, I could think of any other word in terms of either visual or auditory or motor imagery. In all probability the auditory and motor always occur together, but still it is possible to make the one or the other predominate. It appears that the imagery for most persons is a mixture of auditory, motor, and visual elements, with a predominance of one or the other kind. Individuals who utilize almost exclusively the visual, as does the author as a rule, are rare, but rarer still is the pronounced motor type. End of footnotes. When the proper response was up and down, I would think of those directions in space, and likewise with left and right, in which case I would also put myself in the horse's place. While I was still ignorant of the nature of the necessary movements, the tests were successful only when I had put the question aloud or in a whisper, but never when I failed to enunciate, i.e. when I merely had the question in mind, in idea. But this also became possible after a little practice, although I could not then give an explanation for my success. Except in one instance, we could discern no difference between problems spoken and those merely conceived by Mr. von Osten, who had had the advantage of long practice. But the one exception deserves mention. The old gentleman commissioned Hans, presumably without uttering a word, to step backwards to the left. Hans thereupon responded by giving his entire repertoire, as follows. He moved his head to the right, then to the left, then he leaped forwards and repeated the same movement of the head. Hereupon he stepped backward and signified a yes by a movement of the head. He then lowered his head and made 2 leaps forward. After this performance Mr. von Osten repeated the same command aloud, and in every case Hans responded properly. Again the silent command was given, and again the horse responded with the series of reactions described above, lowering his head, leaping forward, etc. In this experiment, without exception, the spoken command evoked adequate reactions, the silent command an incorrect response. Evidently the impulse to movement was not so great with the mere conceiving of right, left, etc., as when the words were enunciated. It, therefore, required some practice on my part before a sufficiently strong movement impulse became associated with the idea. All this is in no wise at variance with the fact that tests involving counting and computation were as successful when the problem was given in silence as when it was spoken. The signs for tapping, namely inclination and erection of the head and body, followed the question. The question therefore became superfluous. On the other hand, the signs for head movements on the part of the horse were given while the question was being put. I ask which way is upward, and at the same time I look upwards. In this case, therefore, the question itself is not entirely insignificant. I experienced greater difficulty in getting Hans to respond with the head movement to the left. After much practice I was able to evoke this movement by means of giving the command aloud, but never by means of the silent command. Accidentally I hit upon a device by means of which I attained this end also. I asked the horse aloud, which direction is left? whereupon he reacted properly. Then I immediately repeated the question silently and was successful every time. My mental attitude here was still the same as when I put the question aloud. What sort of an attitude this was I could not, of course, have stated explicitly at the time. I could not therefore awaken it at will, and if I allowed but a minute to elapse between the spoken and the silent question, the vivid after effect, the so-called primary memory image, soon disappeared and the test was wholly unsuccessful. Practice, however, soon helped me to overcome this last difficulty also. I believe that my inability to evoke this specific reaction on the part of the horse lay in the unfavourable position which I assumed, for it did not allow the horse to perceive my movements easily. For the same reason, Hans would at first indicate no and 0 by turning to the right, seldom to the left. As in the case of counting, a high degree of concentration was also necessary here, but with this difference, that here attention was directed to ideas present to the mind, yes, no, etc., whereas in the counting process attention was directed towards expected sensory impressions, i.e. the taps of the horse. All that has been said thus far is readily understood psychologically. The following curious fact, however, is noteworthy. Hans used the head movement to indicate two such different concepts as 0 and no. It appeared therefore that in both cases he was receiving the same kind of directive. Observation proved that such was the case, and the directive in question was none other than an imitation in miniature, or rather a movement anticipatory of the expected head movement of the horse. Now, whereas the signs for up, down, right, and left were natural expressive movements which are normally associated with the corresponding concepts, this cannot be said to be true of no and 0. My laboratory observations, see page 107, lead me to conclude that the movements, by means of which the concepts no and 0 are naturally expressed, are quite different. Neither of these corresponds to the signs for 0 and no which the questioner involuntarily gave to Hans. What was the genesis of these unnatural forms of expression? If we might assume that the questioner always had in mind the movement he awaited on the part of the horse, and never thought of 0 or no, then the contradiction would solve itself. But I must deny decidedly that I ever thought of the movements of the horse's head, and Mr. Shillings, whom I questioned on this point, agreed with me in this, in so far as his own mental processes were concerned. I can see nothing for it but that in this instance the expressive movements normally connected with the concepts 0 and no have been replaced by other forms, without the questioner becoming aware of it. That such displacements may occur has been shown by the tests described on pages 107 to 112. That they did occur in this instance may be concluded from the following observation. In responding to me, as well as to Mr. Shillings, Hans always moved his head first to the left, then to the right, never in the opposite order. That this was not a peculiarity of the horse, but must be ascribed to the signs which were given him, is shown by the possibility of inverting the order under experimental controls, page 77. Frequently Mr. Shillings and I had seen the horse respond to his master by means of such head movements, and the order was always, without exception, the one mentioned. It must be assumed, therefore, that the horse's movement, which we so often noticed, made such an impression upon us that afterwards it was regularly reproduced on our part quite unconsciously, so that Mr. Shillings never, and I only after a long time, became aware of the whole process. In closing, just a word as to the discovery of our own movements. I soon noticed that every pronounced raising of the head or trunk brought about an interruption in the horse's response. But only by observing the final movement in the case of Mr. von Osten did I discover that I, too, performed a slight erection of the head. Observation of others was less difficult than the observation of one's own movements. As in the case of all other signs given to the horse, these movements were so slight that they were prone to escape notice even though one's whole attention were concentrated upon their detection. I also questioned whether in my attempts to disturb the horse by means of loud calls, it were really the call or some simultaneous involuntary movement which was the true cause of the interruption. The doubt was justified, for when I finally learned to cry out vehemently without making the slightest move, all my crying was in vain. Also, it had seemed to me at first as if I were able to induce the horse to rear, not only by means of the proper sign or movement, but also by a mere command, but I found later that in every case there was always some movement, were it ever so slight. Finally, I tried to simulate voluntarily the oft-mentioned involuntary jerks of the head. Although it is not very difficult to execute them at will with almost the same minuteness as when they were performed involuntarily, I still did not succeed in getting a series of such jerks of equal fineness throughout, in spite of, and partly on account of, the most concentrated attention. There would be from time to time a jerk of somewhat greater extent and energy. As soon as the movement had been executed, I was able to form a good judgment as to its relative extent, but I was unable to regulate the impulse beforehand. With the following comment the chapter will be concluded. Introspections are necessarily subjective in character. If they are to possess general validity, they must be borne out by evidence furnished by others, and this to a greater extent than is necessary for other forms of observation. It was hardly possible to get corroboration from the other persons who had worked with Hans, for, although some of them were excellent observers of external natural phenomena, few of them had had the necessary amount of practice in introspection. The necessary confirmation, however, was had in laboratory tests, which we shall presently describe. End of section 5. Section 6. Chapter 4. Laboratory Tests. The tests which are to be briefly reported here were begun in November 1904 and were carried out at the Psychological Institute at the University of Berlin. The purpose was twofold. First, to discover whether the expressive movements noted in Mr. von Osten, Mr. Schilling's and others were to be regarded as typical and to be found in the majority of individuals, and secondly, to ascertain in how far the psychical processes which I had noted in my own cases and which I believed to lie at the bottom of these movements were paralleled in and confirmed by the introspections of others. The effort was made to make the experimental conditions as nearly as possible like those under which the horse had worked. The affective atmosphere which coloured the situation in which the horse took part could not, of course, be transferred, but this was in some respects an advantage. One person undertook the role of questioner, another, myself, that of the horse. The experiments fall into 3 groups, corresponding to the types of the horse's reactions. 1. Tests in counting and computation. 2. Tests in space reactions. 3. Tests in fetching or designating objects. In the experiments in counting and computation, the questioner, standing at my right, thought with a high degree of concentration of some number, usually between 1 and 10, but sometimes also as high as 100, or of some simple problem in addition. Then I would begin to tap, but in human fashion with my right hand rather than with my foot, and continued until I believed that I had perceived a final signal. I thus tested all in all 25 persons of every age and sex, including children of 5 and 6 years, differing also in nationality and occupation. None of them was aware of the purpose of the experiments. It could not escape them, to be sure, that they were being watched. It was also evident to them that the things noted were certain tensions and movements, but none of my subjects discovered what the particular phenomena were that I was looking for. Only in a few isolated instances did they report that they were conscious of any movements on their part. With the exception of two persons, they all made the same involuntary movements which were described in Chapter 2, the most important of which was the sudden slight upward jerk of the head when the final number was reached. It was at once evident that the direction of this jerk depended upon the position which one had asked the subject to assume at the beginning of the test, the direction changing whenever the position was changed. Thus, if the subject stood with head bowed, the body either being held erect or likewise bowed, then release of tension would be expressed physically by an upward jerk. Occasionally the entire trunk is slightly raised, so that it was possible to observe this physical reaction when standing behind the subject. If the subject had bent his head backwards, the psychological moment was marked by a forward movement, although under certain conditions the head was, in such a case, observed to bend still farther backwards. If during the tests the head was bent slightly to the right, then the reaction was expressed in a movement towards the left, and vice versa. If it had been on the left, it was bent to the right. If the subject had been bending his head forward and to the right, then he would raise it upward and to the left, etc. In all of these changes of position I noticed an intermediate posture which, to be sure, it was not always an easy matter to discover, namely an upright position in which there was discernible no manner of head movement or only a slight tremor. If the subject was lying on his back with his head supported, then there was noticeable a very slight movement to one side. In this same way, a number of other positions were tested in order to discover for each the characteristic movement expressive of release of tension. It would therefore appear the raising of the questioner's head, which served as the signal for stopping for Mr. von Osten's horse, was but one instance of a general law which may perhaps be stated thus. The release of muscular tension, which occurs with the cessation of psychic tension, tends to bring about that position of the head and body which, at the same time, represents the slight amount of muscular strain. These movements seldom were pronounced enough to be compared to motion through a distance of 1 millimetre. In a very few cases only did they attain to the magnitude of 1 or 2 millimetres. I failed to note them entirely, however, in only two individuals, two scientific men whose mode of thought was always the most abstract, and one of these was, in spite of repeated attempts, unable to elicit any response whatever on the part of the horse. In the cases of the more suitable subjects, I was able to indicate not only the number they had in mind, but also the divisions in which the number was thought, thus 12 as 5 and 5 and 2, or the same number as 2 and 5 and 5, and I was also able to determine the addends in the addition, i.e. whether the problem had been conceived as 3 plus 2 equals 5, or as 2 plus 3 equals 5. It frequently happened that in the middle I would sometimes mistake these subdivisions, which were recognizable by the less pronounced jerks, for the final number. Thus I would often respond with 4 instead of 8, or 3 instead of 9, or with 3 when the problem was 3 plus 2, just as Hans had so often done. In these tests, too, the difficulty of getting the number 1 as well as the larger numbers came to light. Thus, 3 times in succession 17 was indicated as 4, as 9, and as 17. But after some practice I was able to give numbers as high as 58 and 96. The frequency of the errors of 1 unit too many and of 1 unit too few is also noticeable in these tests. We also found desirable corroboration, by trustworthy subjects, of the introspective observations of the author, which were reported in Chapter 3, with regard to the significance of concentration and the curve of attention. It is hardly necessary to mention that no attempts were made to influence the subjects in their accounts by asking suggestive questions. The most valuable feature about these tests was that the mute horse had now been replaced, as it were, by an animal capable of speech, and that it was now possible to follow the same process both from within and from without. 2 illustrations may be welcome. The one who took the part of the horse gave 3 taps and made the following entry. At 3 I saw a slight upward jerk of the head on the part of the questioner. The questioner, however, had thought of 4, and made the following note without knowledge of the other's entry. I was aware of extreme tension, so that it was impossible for me to get beyond 3. Or again, the horse, reacting to a movement on the part of the questioner, stopped at 3, but the latter, having intended to obtain 2, made the following entry. I noted clearly that I ceased thinking of the number too late, and did not put on the brakes, as it were, until I had arrived at 3. We see that errors here were entirely the fault of the questioner, just as had been the case in the tests with Hans, see page 151F. In a second group of experiments, I asked a subject to fix his mind upon certain concepts, such as up or down, right or left, yes or no, and others, in any order he pleased, but with the greatest possible degree of concentration. The subjects each time had the choice of 4 or 6 concepts, and he was told to think of one of them at the signal now. How he was to think the concept was left entirely to him. He was also told to interpolate the series with a blank, that is, to think of nothing at all. Standing opposite the subject, I tried to guess at the mental content of the person's mind on the basis of expressive movements. Sometimes I reacted by shaking or nodding the head, etc., just as Hans had done, but as a rule I was content to say the word which I thought the subject had in mind. With 12 subjects, a total of 350 tests, I made an average of 73% correct responses, and in the more favourable cases I obtained even 90 to 100% correct responses. Very slight involuntary movements of the head and eyes, which showed but little individual variation and always occurred when the subject began to fix upon the concept, were the signs which I used as cues. As in the case of the movements expressive of the release of tension which I discussed above, these movements, too, occurred without the subject being aware of them, except in those rare cases in which they had once or twice been especially pronounced. Indeed, it was very difficult, and in some cases almost impossible, for those persons whom I had initiated into the secret to inhibit them voluntarily. Up and down, right and left were expressed by movements of head or eye in those directions, forward by a forward movement of the head, back by a corresponding movement. Yes was accompanied by a slight nod of the head, no by 2 to 4 rapid turnings of the head to either side. Footnote. It was Charles Darwin who first pointed out that the expressive movements, of the coarser sort, to be noted in nearly every race and people show a great, though by no means complete, similarity. The similarity is most pronounced in the shaking of the head to signify negation, and nodding to denote affirmation. It will be noted that the former is essentially of the nature of a turning toward, and the latter a turning away. These same movements have been reported in the case of the blind and deaf Laura Bridgman, and we have been explicitly assured that they were a spontaneous development, and not acquired by imitation. For it is by imitation, and never before the completion of the first year, that our children acquire these movements. On account of his unreliability, we can put but little stock in the statement of Garner, a writer on the speech of monkeys, that these same gestures have been observed in the case of those animals. My experiments show that the same movements, greatly diminished in scope, as a rule accompany the mere thought of yes, no, etc. I cannot, however, regard the assertion as an established fact that every thought process whatsoever is connected with some form of muscular movement, as has been generalized by the French physiologist Ferret and the American psychologist William James. End of footnotes. 0 was expressed by a movement of the head describing an oval in the air. Indeed, it was even possible to discover whether the subject had conceived of a printed or a written 0, for the characteristics of both were revealed in the head movements. I was able later to verify this graphically. With CH as subject, I made 70% correct interpretations in a total of 20 tests. With Von A as subject, 72% in a total of 25 tests. And finally, I was able to interpret the signs without any errors at all. It was not absolutely necessary to look directly at the subject's face, even though I focused a point quite to one side, so that the image of the subject's face would fall upon a peripheral portion of my retina. I was still able to make 89% correct interpretations in a total of 20 tests. This is not astonishing after all, when we recall that the periphery of the retina possesses a relatively high sensitivity for movement impressions, although its chromatic sensitivity is very low. Footnotes. The productions of mind readers, so-called, also are based upon the perceptions of involuntary movements, insofar as they are not based upon prearranged schemes and trickery. But there we have to do principally with tactual perception, since the reader touches the hand of the subject and is guided by its tremor. Some of the expert mind readers, however, conduct tests without touching the subject. They depend chiefly upon auditory impressions, the sound of footsteps, involuntary whisperings, and the changes in a subject's respiration, and the murmuring of the spectators. To a lesser degree, visual signs also are involved, posture and facial expressions of the subject, and movements of eyes and lips. Even the heat radiating from a person's body is supposed to have some influence, and my own experience has taught me that surprising results may be obtained by the utilization of the movements described in the preceding chapter. It may be that these truly microscopic movements also play some part in bringing about the success of some of the experiments in telepathy, so-called, transference of thought from one person to another, ostensibly without any mediation of the senses known to us. In spite of the huge mass of experimental evidence which has been collected, chiefly in England and in America, it appears to me that telepathy is nothing but an unproven hypothesis based upon experimental errors. End of footnote. It was assumed, as indicated on page 99, that in the cases of Mr. Schillings and myself, the movements naturally expressive of 0 and no had been displaced, without our being aware of the fact, by others, namely, those which the horse required as directives for his reactions. Since this was the case, we tried to discover if a similar displacement could be brought about experimentally. The attempt was successful, and we discovered that under suitable conditions we could cause the subject, quite without knowledge on his part, to establish an association between any given concept and any given expressive movement. The following experimental series will serve to illustrate this fact. I had one of the subjects, von A, think of left and right in any order he chose. The command was purposefully given only in a general way, think of right or left. We had agreed that I was to try to guess the mental content of the subject's mind, but I was not to utter a word. Instead, I was to indicate right in every case by an arm movement downward and left by a movement upward. To the subject I gave a fictitious but plausible reason for all this. The behaviour of the subject took the following course. In the first 3 tests he moved his eyes to the right when he thought of right, and to the left when he thought of left. This was the normal expressive movement. In the 4th test, however, the thought left was accompanied by an upward movement of the eyes. 2 further tests again showed eye movements to the right and left. In the 7th test with the idea left, the eyes moved first to the left and then immediately upwards. In the following 10 tests, the eyes were turned regularly upward at the thought of left and downward at the thought of right, with only one exception, which was a normal movement to the left. The normal expressive movements, therefore, were displaced by the artificial after the 7th test. In the case of another subject, B, in whom normally the thought of up was accompanied by a slight raising of the head and down by a downward movement, these natural forms of expression disappeared entirely as a result of my arm movements to the right to indicate that I inferred his having in mind the thought of up, and to the left when I inferred that he was thinking of down. Instead, there appeared not merely the desired movements to the right and left, but rather movements upwards to the right and downwards to the left. That is, instead of a complete displacement of the old by the new, there occurred a combination of the two. A third type of result appeared in still another subject, CH, who normally expressed the concepts right and left by eye or head movements, never both kinds at the same time, to the right and left. Here my arm movements up and down caused the eye and head movements to be made simultaneously, so that the thought of right found expression in an upward movement of the head and an eye movement to the right, and the idea of left in a downward head movement and a movement of the eye to the left. The subject had no knowledge of this process, and it took 6 tests to bring about the new reaction. From that point onwards, the new movements were so well established that, depending on them for my cue, I was able to make 32 correct inferences in a total of 40 tests. In the latter part of this series, I blindfolded the subject so that I could not see the movement of his eyes, and therefore had to base my inference entirely upon his head movements. After removing the bandage at the end of the series, I told the subject that I would go through another series in which I intended to indicate his thought of right by an arm movement downward instead of upward as heretofore, and his thought of left by a movement upward. This he regarded as an idle whim of mine. It was only after the 12th test that the former association, which I myself had caused to be established, was completely displaced by the new. The thought of right was now accompanied by an eye movement to the right, and instead of a raising there was a lowering of the head. A corresponding change occurred in the head movement expressive of the thought of left. These responses were occasionally varied by some in which only the head movement or only the eye movement occurred, but these movements were always to the right or downwards and to the right at the thought of right, and to the left or upward and to the left at the thought of left. In 10 tests I made 10 correct inferences. After the new association appeared firmly established, I ceased responding by means of arm movements and indicated my guesses by word of mouth. At first, the newly acquired movements continued to appear promptly in the subject, but gradually they tended to become more uncertain and finally disappeared as readily as they had appeared, and the normal conditions were once more established. Nor was there any tendency to reappear on the following day in another series of tests. Those just described had been made on one day in the course of an hour or two. But as soon as I again used the earlier method of arm movement to indicate my inferences, raising the arm for right, lowering it for left, the former artificial association was again established, although not until some 14 tests had been made, during which the normal movements to the right and left were often inhibited, and during which the conditions were, on the whole, chaotic. The new association, thus re-established, remained constant during the 10 tests of the remainder of the series, but has very probably again disappeared long ere this. In the case of this subject, it appears therefore that the new associations were superimposed upon, but in no sense displaced, the normal expressive movements, nor did the two coalesce, except in a few exceptional cases, but tended as a rule to occur independently of one another. I would emphasize once more that none of the subjects had any knowledge of the purpose or meaning of the experiments. Also, I was convinced by questioning the subjects afterwards that none of them, and this is the essential point, had merely conceived of the arm movements which they were expecting me to make, instead of concentrating thought upon the idea of right or left. On the contrary, all of them considered my particular movements mere vagaries and without purpose, and they felt perfectly certain that they were in no wise influenced by these movements. Also, none of the subjects was conscious of any movements on their part, except one, who was at times aware of her eye movements to the right, but never of those to the left. See page 111. Nor of the head movements which for us constituted the phenomena of prime interest. When I asked my subjects what they believed to be the cue upon which I based my inferences, they invariably responded with probable explanations which were always wide of the mark, and those to whom I disclosed the cue, after the experiments were completed, were thoroughly astonished. In the tests just described, we had to do only with such ideas or concepts as normally were associated with some stereotyped form of expressive movement. See page 106. I now chose a group of ideas which are not normally associated with a particular form of motor expression peculiarly characteristic of them, and sought to establish artificially such a connection with some arbitrary movement, without consciousness of the process on the part of the subject. Thus I asked one subject, Miss St., who had no intimation of the aim of the tests, to think of the following words in any order she might choose: ibis, 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 panther, kibitz, plover, and kürbis, pumpkin. I said that I would react to her thoughts by means of arm movements forward and backward, to the right and to the left, respectively. 15 out of the 20 tests was successful, without the slightest suspicion on the part of the subject, whose whole attention was concentrated on the word content, that she was giving me the necessary directives in the form of very minute movements of the head and eyes to the right and left, etc. She was greatly astonished that I should be able to guess words so much alike. She did not know that the element of likeness was productive of no difficulty. When, during one of the tests, the subject happened to think spontaneously of the movement she was expecting me to make, she became confused, and as a result, the number of my successful reactions suddenly fell. I never would have discovered the cause had not the subject enlightened me without my asking. I repeated this series with 3 other persons who had had some psychological training. I did not use the same movement for each word in all 3 cases, but indicated the word kibitz, for example, by means of an upward movement in one case, by turning of the head to the right in another, etc. In one of the 3 cases, the tests were almost wholly unsuccessful. The cause for this came to light later, but it would involve too much exposition to discuss it at this point. In the case of the other 2 persons, the tests were successful beyond expectation. I had made my various arm movements only a few times when they presently began to raise their heads slightly when thinking of ibis, and to move it to the right at the thought of kürbis, etc. In the 2 series of 35 tests I did not have a single error. In a number of instances I succeeded in guessing the word upon which the subject had decided, even before the test proper was entered upon, i.e. before the signal for concentration had been given. Nothing surprised the subject more than the remark, "You are intending to think of the word kürbis," or "You had thought of concentrating your mind on ibis, but later decided in favour of kibitz." Yet nothing could be more simple. Before every test the subject would consider what word he would fix upon, and while he was saying to himself, "I will choose ibis," the proper movement would accompany his decision, although it was only very slight, because attention had not yet attained the degree of concentration which was employed in the test proper. In these experiments also, the subjects, whom I know to be absolutely trustworthy, declared that they never thought of the arm movements which I was to make. They regarded them as being quite irrelevant. Also, with but one exception, they thought of the objects, in so far as they imagined them visually, as being directly before them and not off in the direction indicated by my arm movements. Thus they did not image the plover, kibitz, as being on the wing when I raised my arm, or as resting on the ground when I pointed downwards, etc. One of the subjects had done this occasionally, but by no means regularly. He was therefore asked to localize all objects in the same place, i.e. directly in front of him at the level of the eye. He complied with this request, but no change whatever was observed to occur in his expressive movements. In order to overcome the difficulty just mentioned, I selected another subject, Miss Von L., whose power of visualizing was very slight, and requested her to fix her mind upon 4 words which I had selected because they were not necessarily associated with a particular image. The order in which the words were to be thought of was entirely optional on her part. The words were form, Inhalt, mass, and Zahl, form, content, measure, and number, and each of them I accompanied with a certain definite arm movement. The subject always pronounced the word inwardly as emphatically as possible, but without ever imaging the corresponding arm movement. Often, it must be noted, she did not know whether or not the movement which I was to make was the proper one, and yet she, too, soon fell into line in the matter of executing unconsciously the characteristic head movements. In a total of 50 tests, I was able to make 10 correct guesses in the course of the first 20 tests, 8 in the next 10 tests, and 19 in the last 20 tests. Miss Von L. noted only a few of her upward head movements, namely those that were especially pronounced, movements through about 2 millimeters, but of the others she knew nothing. The same experiment was repeated with a psychologist well trained in introspection as a subject. Success was even greater here, but no matter how closely the subject observed himself, he was unable to solve the puzzle. Variations which were introduced in these tests I will only mention in passing. Thus, instead of making an arm movement, I, in some cases, would tap my foot, for ibis 1, for kibitz twice. The subject could not see my feet. The involuntary movement expression which became associated with ibis was 1 nod of the head, with kibitz 2 nods, etc. Here our only concern was to show that unconscious change in natural expressive movements and the acquisition of artificial ones are possible in the case of psychically normal subjects trained in introspection. I was not satisfied with convincing myself subjectively of the facts indicated, but sought to fix them objectively by means of a graphic method. For this purpose I used the device mentioned by Professor R. Sommer for the analysis of expressive movements. The purpose for which Professor Sommer's apparatus had been constructed was to record the involuntary tremor and movement of the hands. These movements, of course, take place in the 3 dimensions of space. By means of 3 levers it is possible to record the movements upon the flat surface of a smoked paper fastened to the revolving drum of the kymograph, the movements in each direction being recorded by a separate lever, in such a way that the 3 curves thus made represent the analysis of a single movement into its 3-dimensional components. By making slight changes which tended to complicate the experiment somewhat, I adapted the apparatus to the measurement of movements of the head. The method of experimentation was the following. The subject whose movements were to be registered was placed in the device in such a way that his trunk and head were bent slightly forward, the latter a little more than the former. This, it will be remembered, was the usual position of the questioner when working with the horse. 3 levers were attached to his head in such a way that every movement backward or forward would act upon the first lever, every movement to the right or left would move the second, and every movement of the head upward or downward would be recorded by the third. With regard to the sensitivity of the machine, micrometric determination showed that when the subject was properly installed, movements through so small a distance as 1/10 of a millimeter could be accurately ascertained. The subject was carefully instructed to remain as quiet as possible, but without constraint. Voluntary movements were thus obviated. But the question arose, were not the involuntary movements thus suffering a loss? And it was upon them that we were experimenting. The question cannot be put aside summarily, but experience taught us that the movements in question, nevertheless, did appear quite effectually, if one could have the right kind of subjects at one's command. We need hardly mention that beside the 2 persons immediately concerned, I myself attended to the apparatus, there was no one else present, and that the subject was not allowed to see the curves produced by the kymograph. Besides the registration of the head movements, I also undertook to register the respiratory movements of the subject. This was done by means of the so-called pneumograph, attached to which was a lever recording the thoracic expansion and contraction. This was for the purpose of ascertaining the relationship, which might eventually be found to exist, between the release of psychic tension on the one hand and respiration on the other. The subject was now told to think of some number, which of course was unknown to me. At a given moment I was to tap upon one of a series of keys arranged like those of a piano, with the middle finger of my right hand, corresponding to the right forefoot of the horse. The questioner observed my key, I his head, just what had happened in the experiments with Hans, and as soon as I perceived the involuntary closing signal I reacted upon it by releasing, suddenly, another key upon the same keyboard, which I had in the meantime been pressing down with my second finger, thus marking what with Hans would have been called the back step. Each key was connected with a separate electromagnet, and these in turn with markers, in such a manner that pressure upon the keys closed 2 electric circuits and, releasing the keys, opened them, and both the closing and opening were recorded upon the smoked paper by means of the markers. And finally, in order to ascertain the time relations of all these processes, a time marker indicated the time in 5th seconds upon the revolving kymograph record. The time curve was recorded just below the other curves. Of the curves, footnote, for registering the curves a Herring kymograph was used, with a loop 2.5 meters long. The kymograph rested on felt. With the aid of the Mary model, a pneumographic record was taken now of the thoracic, now of the abdominal breathing, never both simultaneously, since this was extrinsic to my purpose, and would have made the whole experiment too complex. The time was recorded by means of the Jacquet chronograph. For purposes of making more exact measurements, the acoustic current interrupter of Bernstein was used, attuned to 100 vibrations per second. But this necessitated such rapid revolution of the drum of the kymograph that the curves were not compact enough for purposes of demonstration. The levers were all fitted with micrometer adjustments. They wrote tangentially, and, except the one registering the breathing curve, all points lay in one vertical line. The error of deflection and that due to the rondure of the writing servers were both very slight on account of the comparative length of the levers and the small extent of the excursions, and for that reason synchronous points lie practically in one perpendicular. Only the breathing curve has been moved somewhat to the left, 7.5 mm in Figures 6 and 7, 2 mm in Figure 8, 4.5 mm in Figure 9. When the breathing was very profound, as often happened, the error of deflection would, of course, have to be taken into account. The curves here used as illustration have been reproduced in the exact size of the originals by the zincographic method, though somewhat compressed vertically in order to economize space. End of footnote. Thus obtained under the most equable conditions possible, we publish 7 which show the great general uniformity of the tests made upon the horse with those made in the laboratory. The role of questioner was undertaken at different times by Mr. Schillings, and the subjects of philosophy, Messrs. von Alles, Chaim, and K. Zoeger von Manteuffel. To all of them I am greatly indebted for their unselfish services in these laboratory tests. The experiments with Mr. von Alles and Chaim, who were among the most suitable of my subjects, were conducted absolutely without knowledge on their part of the nature of the phenomena which I was observing. Neither of them knew anything about the expressive movements in which they were unconsciously indulging, and furthermore, since they kept their heads bowed during the entire course of these experiments, they did not perceive what it was that I was observing. It is interesting to note that Chaim, on the occasion of his only visit to the horse, immediately received a number of correct responses. Without a doubt von Alles would have met with equal success. The other two subjects, von M and SCH, went through this series of tests, possessing some knowledge of the nature of the movements involved. Conditions were such that they, and especially Mr. Schillings, could not be prevented from obtaining some knowledge of the essentials at least. However, it would be wrong to suppose that for this reason the results were more favourable, owing, mayhap, to voluntary efforts on the part of the subject. The contrary was true. The two subjects who had no knowledge of the character of the reactions upon which my responses depended retained their normal habits unchanged throughout the series, whereas the last named two, afraid lest their knowledge vitiate the result, lost more and more of their power of concentration, and within a short time were in a condition of tense inhibition, which is all the more conceivable since they had no psychological training whatever. Footnote. My own expressive movements, on the other hand, are as pronounced as ever. I still find the attempt to suppress them as difficult now as when I was working with the horse, page 57. I could not, of course, procure a curve of these movements of my own. End of footnote. Their movements, which at first were quite profuse, decreased more and more, so that in the case of von Manteuffel, the percentage of my successful responses sank from 73% correct responses in 90 tests to 20% in a total of 20 tests, and in the case of Schillings, from 75 to 100% to 23% in a series of 35 tests. The curves obtained with von Manteuffel as subject, which I am here publishing, figures 8 and 15, are, however, true to his normal habits. The same is true of the two first curves of Schillings, figures 10 and 11, whereas the third, figure 12, shows distinctively the traces of the state of inhibition into which he fell, and represents the same condition as when Mr. Schillings, while preoccupied, tried to work with Hans. All the finer details of the phenomena in question were likewise unknown to these two subjects. For purposes of a clearer understanding of the various curves, Figure 5 is inserted to give the general scheme of their arrangement. All curves are to be read like script from left to right. The first is the breathing curve of the questioner. The second, third, and fourth curves represent his head movements, all translated through the workings of the levers into up and down movements. The objective direction of these head movements is indicated by the arrows. It will be noted that, because the lever in question was one with two arms and therefore reverses all movements made, each lowering of the head is indicated by a rise in the fourth curve, and each raising of the head is recorded by a sinking in the same curve. The records of the head movements forwards and backwards and to the left and right, curves 2 and 3, are 2 1/2 times the size of the actual movements, while the curve of the movements up and down, curve 4, which is of a special interest to us, is 5 times its actual size. The fifth and sixth curves, which record my own responses, represent the taps of the horse, the fifth indicating the number of taps, and the sixth the back step, which was Hans's reaction when he noted the head jerk of the questioner. The seventh, the lowest line, indicates the time in fifth seconds. Since the rate at which the drum revolved was not uniform for all the tests, the fifth second marks do not appear the same distance apart in all the records, but are farther apart the greater the rapidity with which the drum revolved. For the experiment itself this is quite immaterial. Figures 6 to 9 correspond in detail with the diagram just described. Figures 10 and 12 differ only in that the breathing and backstep curves, the first and sixth in the diagram, are lacking. In these, there is no response on my part to the head jerk of the subject, but tapping was continued ad libitum. In the case of the illustrations here given, I tapped to 5. When these latter curves were taken, the ordering and the technique of the experiments had not yet been perfected. When this was finally done, Mr. Schillings, who acted as subject in those tests, had to be eliminated from the ranks of appropriate subjects on account of the increasing inhibitions which gradually developed as described on page 120. Analysis of such curves is rather difficult, and those of different subjects cannot be directly compared. It is necessary to make a study of the normal curve of each subject taken when his affective state could be described as indifferent. The influences of the purely physiological processes, such as pulse, footnotes. Slight head movements accompanying the pulse beat were until recently regarded as the symptom of certain diseases of the vascular system, the so-called symptom of Nusse. But H. Frenkel has now shown them to exist also in normal individuals. I myself discovered such movements, lateral as well as sagittal, more or less pronounced in all the curves obtained from my subjects. The most striking case was that of a young physician whose circulatory system was perfectly healthy. In most instances I was able to note these oscillatory movements directly and to count them without much difficulty. For purposes of control, the radial pulse was always determined at the same time. The observation of the phenomenon appears to be especially easy in the case of somewhat full-blooded individuals, end of footnote, and respiration must also be determined. And even so, an interpretation of the curve becomes possible only when a large mass of material is at hand, and when the introspections of the subject are taken into consideration. The following remarks, therefore, are not based solely upon the illustrations given, but upon the mass total of my results. In beginning our analysis, let us take first the breathing curve. Our results here were quite in accord with the view taken by Zoneff and Moyman, who believe that in the respiration is to be found a good index of the effective tone of the subject's mental state. In the greater number of cases it was possible to conclude as to the degree of concentration of attention, and when this was very great it was even possible to get a clue as to the number thought of. Since the high degree of tension under which a subject laboured during a test would be accompanied by strong effective colouring, we cannot regard as normal any of the curves here reproduced, with the exception of the two high points in Figure 9. Although breathing was always deep and regular before and after a test, during the test it was less deep and irregular. Very often it was suspended altogether, Figures 7, 8 and 9. In ordinary life we often notice that highly concentrated attention is usually accompanied by non-voluntary inhibition of movements in the musculature which, for the moment, is not directly involved. The man lost in thought slackens his pace and finally stands still. The intent listener or looker-on holds his breath. Of the three curves registering the movement of the head, we find that nothing peculiarly characteristic is revealed by the two upper ones, given the movements up and down and to the right and left respectively. They are the ordinary tremor-like movements and indicate nothing beyond the fact that the subject is unable to hold his head absolutely quiet for even 1 second. It is the third line that is of interest to us, for it is here that the oft-mentioned head jerk, which indicates arrival in the counting at the number expected, registers itself. The moment of the head jerk corresponds, almost without exception, with the moment of the first deep inhalation, just as one would be led to expect from common experience. But we are not to regard the head jerk as a result of the inhalation, for it also occurs when the subject complies with the request that he hold his breath during the test. The actual height of the jerks recorded in Figures 6 to 12 was 1/4 to 1½ millimeters, and the average height obtained from the 40 curves of these 4 subjects was 1 millimeter. There is great individual variation. The greatest height that was obtained from the records was 2 3/10 millimeters, the lowest 1/10 of a millimeter. The variations within the records of the several individuals are comparatively slight and are evidently dependent, in the main, upon the degree of concentration of attention. Thus, in the case of von Alles, where in 75 tests the average height of the jerk is 1 millimeter, the mean variation is 4/10 of a millimeter. If, in order to obtain some idea of the size of Mr. von Osten's movements, Footnotes, in a special series of experiments, a subject was instructed to execute rapid head movements as minute and as evenly as possible. These were registered objectively, and at the same time I made judgments concerning them. The results showed that my judgments were most exact in the case of the most minute jerks. The thing that made it especially easy to judge the movements of Mr. von Osten under normal conditions, page 220, was their extraordinary evenness, such as I have not met with in any other individual. End of footnote. We compared the values gained in the laboratory with those which would probably obtain in his case. We would say that his head movements were more minute than almost any of those of which we obtained records. At the most they could not have been more than 1/5 of a millimeter. When measured in terms of the distance through which the brim of his broad hat moved, they would appear to be about 1½ times as large. See page 49. The movements of Mr. Schilling's, on the other hand, were certainly 4 or 5 times as great as those of Mr. von Osten, and occasionally even greater than that. When we turn to consider the time interval elapsing between the subject's final head jerk and my reaction, as recorded in the 6th curve, we find that the reaction time averages 3/10 of a second, a value which agrees very favourably with that estimated for the horse, page 56. Thus it appears that man and beast have the same reaction time, though we must bear in mind that I worked under some difficulty, since I had to care for the apparatus. Let us now turn to a discussion of the several figures. Figure 6, von Alles, gives a typical view of the great and at the same time economic concentration of attention characteristic of the subject. Respiration, first curve, is not so profound as usual, yet is changed very little. The head jerk, fourth curve, is of medium height. It occurs just at the proper moment. The subject had thought of 2, and had directed his attention economically. This attention was of the kind described as type 1 on page 93. The lowering of the head, recorded in the figure by a rise in the curve, immediately following upon the head jerk upward, is irrelevant. In figure 7, Chame, we have a record of a different nature. Respiration was inhibited throughout the test. The small waves are due to the pulsating of the heart. Immediately after the test, deep breathing takes place. Tension steadily increases till 3, the number expected, was reached. The head accordingly gradually sank a little forward. The head jerk ensued during an interval beginning just before the reaching of the goal and ended immediately after. The movement was predominantly backwards, its upward direction being only through a distance of 1/4 of a millimetre. This subject was not so strongly motor as the preceding one. The reaction followed promptly as seen in curve 6. It was the decided raising of the head which follows the head jerk that prevented the usual back step with the left foot when the subject was working with Hans. Figure 8, von Manteuffel, is typical of strong and at the same time economical concentration. Respiration, normally deep and very regular, is for a time completely inhibited. Tension rises steadily and the head gradually inclines forward. In the interval between the number before the final one and the final one, the subject makes a sudden bend forward and immediately upon reaching the final number gives a violent jerk of the head upwards. The attention here would be characterized as being of type 3, described on page 94. Owing to the lack of space, it is impossible to give an example of type 2, which is only to be found in the case of very large numbers. Figure 9, von Alesch, is expressive of great, but according to the subject's introspection, not economical concentration. Respiration, which before and after the test was quite regular, during the test itself shows a pause. The tiny waves are due to the heartbeats. The subject had thought of 5, and this number is accompanied by a decided head jerk. But we note that even before the final jerk, a number of less pronounced jerks occur, the result of poorly regulated psychic tension. Figure 10, Schilling's, depicts a very high degree of uneconomical concentration. There was sudden concentration at the beginning of the test and a steady increase throughout its course. Accordingly, Mr. Schillings bent forward at the start and inclined still farther forward at the second and just before the third tap. But at 3 there is a sudden upward jerk. The number thought of had been 4. Tension therefore had exploded, as it were, too soon. Figure 11, again of Schillings, gives indications, on the other hand, of a medium and economic concentration of attention, which is more normal in character. The number thought of was 4. Figure 12, Schillings again, is indicative of a low degree of psychic tension. With the very first tap, the head begins to rise and continues to do so throughout the test. A true final jerk does not occur. We note rather in all 3 curves registering the head movements slight time-marking movements, especially in the second curve. In the third curve they are at the first minute, but steadily increase in size until the 4th tap, after which they suddenly disappear. The subject had, as a matter of fact, thought of the number 4, but it is hardly probable that Hans would have reacted properly upon these stimuli. Mr. Schillings had thought of the same number in all 3 tests given in figures 10, 11, and 12. The probabilities are that if he had been working with the horse at that time, in the first case Hans would have reacted with 3 taps with the right foot and a final tap with the left as a result of the questioner's bending forward again after the premature head jerk at 3. In the second instance, the horse would probably have given 4 taps with the right foot, and in the third, the chances are he would have continued to tap beyond the 4. These curves give, on the whole, a fair idea of the intensity and of the course of attention of the various subjects. Let us now consider a number of records which illustrate the expressive movements involved in the process of thinking of such concepts as up, down, etc. Their arrangement is identical with the scheme given in Figure 5, with the exception that the tapping curves, the 6th and 7th, do not appear. The subject was asked to think of any of the words up, down, right, left, yes, no, etc. He was to begin to conceive them vividly when the command now was given. This movement is recorded in Figure 13 to 15 on the 5th curve. What has been said on page 123 with regard to respiration holds also in these instances. Only the first rise recorded in Figure 14 can be regarded as normal. The magnitude of these movements varies between 1/2 and 3 millimeters. The record of the subject whose movements were the most extensive show an average of 1 7/10 millimeters, based on 50 tests, with a mean variation of 0.6 of a millimeter. Lack of space precludes the reproduction of more than 3 records. Figure 13, von Alisch, shows the movement accompanying the thought of up, a slight raise of the head recorded in the 4th curve. The thought of down is accompanied by a corresponding downward movement. Figures 14, von Alisch, and 15, von Manteuffel, illustrate the nod which is associated with the thought of yes in the case of 2 subjects. It is essentially the same in both. The head is lowered and then raised. The first of the 2 subjects is more decidedly motor, and his movements therefore were somewhat more extensive. In the case of the second subject, the nod proper is followed by another which is somewhat less extensive. A number of other experiments were carried out which corresponded with the colour selecting tests made upon Hans, page 78. 5 sheets of white paper, 1/2 metre long and 1/4 metre wide, were arranged in a series upon the floor, 1/4 metre apart, a dot marking the middle of each. The experimenter stood at a distance of 7½ metres and directly opposite the middle sheet. At about 1/2 metre to the right or left of him stood the subject who took the part of the horse. The problem of the experimenter was to indicate to the horse a certain one of the 5 sheets, but without the use of word or gesture. I at first undertook the role of horse, whereas the others consecutively played the part of questioner. All of them looked fixedly at the sheet which they had in mind. Besides, it usually happened that they would turn at least their heads, and often their bodies, more or less in the direction of the particular sheet, and this without purpose or knowledge on their part, but purely as a result of concentration upon the sheet they wished me to point out. One of the experimenters remarked, quite casually, that he had noted that I always made a better judgment the more intently he thought of the sheet. Others often admitted that when I had made an error, they had not imagined the sheet vividly, or had been debating whether or not to decide to think of the neighbouring sheet, the one I had designated. This indecision could be noticed by the direction of the eyes, but the following table shows how uniform, on the whole, was the behaviour of the various persons when under the guidance of the same impulse. The number of tests was 200 in each case. All errors were of the same character. Neighbouring sheets were mistaken for each other, and the errors were never of more than 1 position to either side. Their numbers can easily be obtained by subtracting the percentage of correct inferences from the total, 100%. Experimenter VA, correct inferences 88%. Experimenter B, correct inferences 88%. Experimenter C, correct inferences 77%. Experimenter Mrs. VH, correct inferences 81%. Experimenter K, correct inferences 77%. Experimenter Miss VL, correct inferences 82%. It will be seen that the number of correct interpretations is quite high, and in none of the cases does it deviate far from the mean average of 82%. I base my judgment as to the direction of the subject's eyes upon an imaginary line perpendicular to the centre of the cornea. This perpendicular does not always coincide with the subject's line of vision, which was the thing I was after, but this cannot be directly obtained. This, of course, was what made the judgment a rather difficult matter. My judgment as to the direction of the head I based largely on the direction of the nose. To express it more accurately, upon the direction of the median plane. I purposefully noted only the position of the experimenter and not the movement which led up to it. When I tried to do the latter, the results were not always satisfactory, because the head and eyes of the person would frequently, in the process of adjustment, move beyond the goal and thus lead me into error. An attempt was made to make each judgment as independent as possible of the preceding one, but usually after a few tests an unintentional association became established between certain attitudes and the different places in the series of papers. Often all that was necessary was to observe the experimenter in order to know which of the places he had in mind. It was not necessary to look at the papers at all. Every change in the position of the person would, of course, make the association thus established useless. Later, the subjects and I changed roles. I took the part of the experimenter and they the part of the horse. The number of tests in each case was 200 as before. Here, too, errors were, but with one exception, never more than one place to either side. Whether the error was one place to the right or one place to the left appeared to depend upon the position of the person making the judgment, i.e. it depended on whether he stood at my right or at my left. The following results were obtained. Subject, horse, VA, correct inferences 76%. Subject, B, correct inferences 79%. Subject, C, correct inferences 75%. Subject, Mrs. V.H., correct inferences 81%. Subject, K, correct inferences 77%. Subject, Miss V.L., correct inferences 74%. A certain agreement can be seen in these results. The average of correct inferences is somewhat lower than that which was obtained by me, page 135, 77% as over against 82%. This is probably due to the fact that the subjects had had so little practice compared with me. With one of these subjects, Mr. Kofka, a student of philosophy, I carried these tests somewhat further, varying them partly by increasing the number of sheets of paper, partly by decreasing the distance between them. The increase in the number of sheets made only a slight difference in the results. With 200 tests in each case, I obtained the following results. Number of sheets, 5. Correct inferences, 77%. Number of sheets, 6. Correct inferences, 72%. Number of sheets, 7. Correct inferences, 72%. Number of sheets, 8. Correct inferences, 69%. Number of sheets, 9. Correct inferences, 73%. Number of sheets, 10. Correct inferences, 68%. With but few exceptions, the errors were, as a rule, of one place. The series with an odd number of sheets, 5, 7, 9, gave better results than those with an even number, 6, 8, 10. In the tests with the odd number of sheets, the experimenter, K, stood in front of the middle sheet, so that it was at the apex of a right angle made by the series of papers and the median plane of the subject's body. Whereas in the case of the even number of papers, the subject stood opposite the space between the two middle sheets, thus making the position of the sheet less favourable. In the preceding tests, the distance between the centres of the neighbouring sheets was always 50 centimetres, so that the angle through which the median plane of the experimenter's body would have to turn in order to pass from one sheet to the next was about 3 3/4 degrees. In the following tests, the distances were gradually decreased. The sheets, always 5 in number, were replaced by ever narrower white strips of paper mounted on dark cardboard and illuminated by a Nernst lamp. The following table shows the decrease in correct inferences running parallel with the decrease of the angle through which the subject would have to turn in order to be in line with the several pieces of a series successively. The percentage in each case is based on at least 100 tests. Angle, 3 3/4 degrees. Distance between the centres of the two neighbouring papers, 50 centimetres. Number of correct inferences, 77%. Angle, 3 degrees. Distance, 39 centimetres. Number of correct inferences, 73%. Angle, 2½ degrees. Distance, 33 centimetres. Number of correct inferences, 71%. Angle, 2 degrees. Distance, 26 centimetres. Number of correct inferences, 68%. Angle, 1½ degrees. Distance, 20 centimetres. Number of correct inferences, 66%. Angle, 1 degree. Distance, 13 centimetres. Number of correct inferences, 61%. A curious and unexpected change was here noted in the subject, Mr. Kofka, who, while concentrating his attention to the uttermost, began unawares to develop a new system of expressive movements of the head. When the distance between the sheets was relatively great, he had been in the habit of turning his head and eyes in the direction of the sheet intended. and as the distances became less, he had reacted only by a turning of the eyes. But now, as the distances were still further decreased, he began again to react by means of head movements, and these were of exaggerated magnitude, for which he would compensate, as it were, by an eye movement in the opposite direction. Although the head movements decreased in scope as the distances between the sheets were steadily decreased, they still were always decidedly greater than the eye movements, which I was now normally led to expect and which could be judged without much difficulty. This form of reaction was much more satisfactory as a cue, and therefore it came to pass that, whereas in the preceding series I had made only 60% correct inferences when the angle was 1 degree, I now found that, the angle remaining the same, 80% of my inferences were correct. The final judgment I continued to base as before upon the position and not upon the movement of head and eye. The number of correct inferences continued relatively high, even after the distance between the papers was decreased tenfold, as will be seen in the following table. Angle, 1 degree. Distance between the centres of two neighbouring papers, 131 millimeters. Percentage of correct inferences, 80%. Angle, 30 minutes. Distance, 65 millimeters. Percent of correct inferences, 79%. Angle, 15 minutes. Distance, 33 millimeters. Percentage of correct inferences, 78%. Angle, 9 minutes. Distance, 20 millimeters. Percentage of correct inferences, 81%. Angle, 7 minutes. Distance, 15 millimeters. Percentage of correct inferences, 84%. Angle, 6 minutes. Distance, 13 millimeters. Percentage of correct inferences, 80%. Angle, 5 minutes. Distance, 11 millimeters. Percentage of correct inferences, 77%. Angle, 3 minutes. Distance, 6.5 millimeters. Percentage of correct inferences, 68%. Angle, 2 minutes. Distance, 4 millimeters. Percentage of correct inferences, 68%. Beginning with an angle of 1 minute, distance between the centres of the two neighbouring papers equals 2 millimeters, the subject was unable to focus with sufficient steadiness of vision upon one paper alone, and the movements for that reason ceased to manifest themselves. Comparing the results obtained in the case of this study with those obtained from two others whose reactions had remained normal, B and Miss St, we find that with them there were only 53% correct inferences in both cases, based each upon 200 tests, when the angle was 5 minutes. In my errors, too, I often shot wider of the mark. In another series of 200 tests, in which Miss St merely thought of the places, I had a percentage of 56% correct inferences, and my errors did not become any coarser. Miss St believed this a case of true telepathy, but I had been guided in my judgments entirely by her unwittingly made movements, or rather the direction of her eyes. The magnitude of these movements bore a constant relationship to the distance between the papers, as it was conceived by the subject. Reviewing the experiments discussed in this chapter, we find that the same kind of movements and postures, which had been noted in persons experimenting with the horse, tended to recur in the laboratory, insofar as the mental attitude of the subjects, given their introspective accounts, corresponded with that of the questioners of the horse. End of section 6. Section 7, Chapter 5, Explanation of the Observations, Part 1. The author, having described the observations made upon the horse, and having discussed the activities of the questioner upon the basis of observations made objectively and upon his own introspections, and having verified the results thus obtained by means of laboratory tests, we are now in a position to solve satisfactorily all the problems which this interesting case has presented. That which is least difficult to understand is the horse's seeming knowledge of language and particularly his ability to answer questions, no matter by whom or in what dialect they were put. As a matter of fact, it made no difference who desired an answer, for the only person upon whom the experiment depended was the questioner, that is, the one who asked the horse to tap. We have everywhere designated this person as the experimenter or questioner. It was he who gave the directions, and since all that were involved were visual signs, the drama in which Hans appeared as the hero was nothing but a pantomime. All speech was superfluous, and, except in so far as the tone of voice in which it was spoken was soothing or reprimanding, it was quite unintelligible to the horse. From the foregoing, the reader understands without further explanation Hans's ability to count and to make computations. If the number of taps had depended solely upon the length of time and the angle at which the questioner bent forward, the horse would have been able to tap any number desired. Since, however, only the right foot was employed, the left one being used at most for making a final tap, the number of taps had an upper limit which was due to the fatigue of the animal. This limit was about 100. That it was possible to ask such questions as how many times is 100,000 contained in 654,321, and thus to give problems involving millions, is perfectly clear. All wonderful feats of counting and computation which were accomplished while thus experimenting with the horse are to be credited, not to the horse, but to the questioner. If such is the case, they certainly cannot be considered astonishing. Thus, when to the question, how many of the gentlemen present are wearing straw hats, the horse answers correctly in accordance to the wording of the question and omits the straw hat of a lady, then Mr. von Osten is the guide. It is no wonder that Hans never showed the slightest excitement when confronted with difficult problems, nor that it apparently took no time whatever to solve them. Hans, however, was also a faithful mirror of all the errors of the questioner. Apart from mistakes due to occasional interruptions on the part of visitors, these errors had two sources: faulty computation and inadequate concentration, i.e., aside from arithmetical errors on the part of the questioner, were his premature or belated movements. Since both of these factors might be operative, the following three possibilities arise. A. The questioner computes correctly but does not move at the proper moment. Nearly all the errors which had been accredited to the horse were of this kind. A part of these errors had the appearance of being significant, that is, they might be interpreted as a misapprehension of the question. If, for instance, instead of a sum only one of the quantities was given, or if instead of a product only one of the factors was given, it might be interpreted that the horse simply wished to repeat the problem. Thus, Mr. von Osten, in response to the question, how much is 3 times 5, twice in succession received the answer 3, and upon my question, how much is 3 plus 4, he tapped 3, and to how much is 2 times 6, he tapped 6, and to what is 1/4 of 36, 4. In part, certainly in the second and third example cited, an individual quantity or factor had been emphasized in the consciousness of the questioner. Compare page 105, and in part the reactions were due to chance. Thus, when Mr. Rahn asked the question, what is half of 10, he received the following responses: 2 and 10, and then 17 and 3. To this class belong also the tests made by the Commission of September and reported in Supplement 3. See page 255. Other errors, even though they may not have appeared to be significant, might yet have been characterized as mistakes due to speed, as when, e.g., Hans made an error of 1 unit, and sometimes, though less frequently, of 2 units, too much or too little in his response. One might be led to believe that Hans had not made an error of calculation, but merely of counting in the process of giving his result, which always had to be done by the cumbersome method of tapping. As a matter of fact, the trouble lay in the wrong degree of concentration on the part of the questioner. In errors of +1, tension was too slight. In those of -1, it was too great. See page 91. This comes out clearly in a comparison of the two more extensive series which I took in the case of Mr. Schillings. During the first series he was well disposed and was able to concentrate effectively, while during the second he was nervous and easily diverted. This difference in intensity of concentration in the case of the two series is attested not only subjectively by Mr. Schillings's introspective statement, but may be measured objectively by means of the number of final taps which the horse gave with his left foot during these two series. We saw, page 94, that these final taps were always a sign of intense concentration, and, as a matter of fact, 1/2 of the horse's responses to Mr. Schillings during the first series were made in this way, whereas in the second series only 1/3 were of this sort. I myself was never able to get, without conscious control, a greater number of this type of response. We may therefore say that, in the first series we had a high degree of tension or concentration, whereas in the second series we had a low degree. The errors distribute themselves over the two series as follows. Series 1, 31 tests. Correct responses, 87%. Incorrect responses, +1, 0%. +2, 0%, -1, 13%, -2, 0%. Series 2, 40 tests. Correct responses, 40%. Incorrect responses, +1, 40%, +2, 8%, -1, 2.5%, -2, 0%, and 9.5% other kinds of errors. We find in Series 1 no +1 errors, but only -1 errors. In Series 2, on the other hand, the errors are almost exclusively in the +1 category, equaling the number of correct responses, and there is only one -1 error. A series obtained in the case of Mr. von Osten is almost as satisfactory an illustration. When he first began to take part in tests in which the procedure was the one we characterized as without knowledge, and had to note their complete failure, he was thrown into such confusion that the responses in the case of procedure with knowledge were also incorrect. The errors there were always +1, whereas those in the case of procedure with knowledge, which were due to quite different causes, were very great and inconstant. The number of +1 errors obtained on this occasion comprises 1/4 of all the plus errors which were ever obtained in the case of Mr. von Osten during the entire course of these experiments. Finally, I would mention two examples of my own. In the course of my very first attempts with Hans, I obtained, as I said on page 89, 3 responses in a total of 5, which exceeded the correct result by 1. This I would explain by the fact that although I employed a high degree of concentration, I nevertheless was somewhat sceptical. The result was a certain deficiency in the degree of concentration. The second example which I would cite is taken from the period in which I had already discovered the cue to Hans's reactions, and goes to show that I was then still able to eliminate the influence of this knowledge and to work ingeniously. To the question, how much is 9 less 1, I, momentarily indisposed, received the answer 10, then 6 times in succession the answer 9, and finally the correct response 8. Errors of another kind, though not infrequent offences against the very elements of counting and the fundamental arithmetical processes, were regarded in part as intentional jokes and by an authority in pedagogy as a sign of independence and stubbornness which might also be called humour. Hans emphatically asserted that 2 + 2 was 3, or he would answer questions given in immediate succession as follows. How many eyes have you? 2. How many ears? 2. How many tails? 2. These errors, as a matter of fact, evince neither wit nor humour, but prove incontrovertibly that Hans had not even mastered the fundamentals. Many of the errors baffle every charitable attempt at interpretation. These gave the horse the reputation of capriciousness and unreliability. If Hans designated the tone E as the 17th, or G as the 11th, or when he called Friday the 35th day of the week, or believed 50 pfennig to be worth only 48, the cause of these responses lay either in the insufficient degree of tension on the part of the questioner, as in the first 3 examples, or in the extravagant expenditure of the same, as in the last case. If, therefore, the horse at times would hopelessly flounder, which would seem to be indicated by tapping now with the right and now with the left foot, then, as a matter of fact, this form of reaction came about as was described on page 61, with this difference that there we had to do with the voluntary controlled movements on the part of the questioner, whereas here they are the result of an unsuitable degree of tension which expressed itself in frequent and disconcerting jerks. Besides the answer 3, this so-called floundering was the only reaction the average person could obtain from the horse in the absence of Mr. von Osten and Mr. Schillings. It would, however, occur also in the case of these gentlemen, and would be received by them with resentment, when in truth it was Hans's greatest feat, for he showed his extremely keen reaction upon every movement of the questioner. To this group belong also the errors in the case of higher numbers, the sole cause of which lay in the difficulty with which tension could be maintained, and the body kept motionless for so long a period. These errors occurred in accordance with a certain law. If, for instance, a certain test repeatedly evoked incorrect responses, the questioner would gradually increase the duration of tension and would thus come a little nearer to the desired goal with every test. In this way, Mr. von Osten, desiring 30 as an answer, obtained consecutively the responses 25, 28, 30, and I myself, for the answer 20, received consecutively the responses 10, 18, 20. See also the laboratory tests, page 105. Sometimes, too, the questioner would flag in his efforts before the goal was reached. Thus, in one of my first tests, I received for the answer 11 the following responses: 1, 4, 5, 7, 4. I was unable to get beyond 7. In other instances, the horse responded first with too few and then with too many taps. The correct response, therefore, could only be obtained after an appreciable amount of gauging of tension, as in target practice there must be a gauging of distance. See page 92. In this way, Mr. von Osten obtained for 10 the responses 8, 8, 11, 10, and Mr. Schillings for 17 received 9, 16, 19, 18, 18, 14, 9, 9, and finally, after some efforts, 17 taps. Thus there was a rise from 9 to 19, then a fall back to 9, and after 8 tests the correct response. As long as we attempt to explain this fact as error on the part of the horse, so long will it remain inexplicable. But the moment we regard it from the point of view of the psychology of the tension of expectation, it becomes perfectly plain. The same holds true for the curious predilection which Hans appears to have for the numbers from 2 to 4, especially for 3. See page 68. As a matter of fact, the cause of this lies in nothing other than the inadequate concentration of attention on the part of the questioner, and less often in an extravagant expenditure of concentration, which implodes immediately after the first tap on the part of Hans, as in the case of my first tests. But usually the cause lay in a complete lack of concentration, though the same result may be produced by various causes. It is usually after 2 to 4 taps of the horse's foot that the questioner, who does not concentrate, makes his first move, which naturally puts an end to the tapping on the part of the horse. As a rule, this jerk follows immediately upon the second tap. On the other hand, relaxation of attention is very difficult upon the first tap. See page 95. The questioner, however, would expect further tapping, and therefore would not bring his body back to a complete erect position, and the result would be a 3, the last unit of which would be given by the final tap with the left foot. Here we also obtained light as to the answers which Hans gave in those tests in which the method was that of procedure without knowledge. These responses had nothing to do with the problem, for neither the horse nor anyone else knew the solution. But in the horse's responses, the degree of tension of the questioner's concentration was faithfully mirrored. An experimenter who was skillful in concentrating, as Mr. von Osten, obtained, almost without exception, very high numbers, whereas one whose concentration was slight would receive in response to nearly all questions the answers 2, 3, or 4. Thus, the Count zu Castell received in response to 17 questions the answers 2, 3 times, the answer 3, 6 times, and the answer 4, 4 times, 2 answers being accidentally correct. Another group of errors was characterized as stubbornness on the part of Hans, such as his persistence in repeating an incorrect response, or his repetition of a former correct answer in response to later questions where it was perfectly senseless. During a demonstration before a large number of persons, I held a slate with the number 13 upon it within the horse's view and also within view of the spectators. I, myself, did not know what number was written on the slate. Having been asked to tap the number, Hans responded by tapping 5. The grandstand shouted, "Wrong!" I asked Hans to try again. 4 times in succession he answered 5. At another time Mr. von Osten and I each whispered a number, 7 and 1 respectively, into the horse's ear and asked him to add the two. 3 times in succession he tapped 11. After the test had been repeated in accordance with procedure with knowledge, and a correct response had been received, we tried once more a test of procedure without knowledge. Again he responded with an 11. On a third occasion I asked Hans to tap 5. He responded with a 4, and then, correctly, with a 5. Thereupon I asked him to tap 6. Again he responded with a 4. Then I asked him to tap 7. Once more he responded with a 4, and only when I proceeded to count aloud did he tap 7 correctly. I had him repeat the 7, and then went over to 9. Promptly he responded with another 7. In these cases, which by the way were not very frequent, we have to do not with stubbornness on the part of Hans, but with the persistence of that number in the consciousness of the questioner. Modern psychology has recognized this tendency of ideas, which have once been in consciousness, to reappear on other occasions even though they are wholly inappropriate. This has been termed perseverative tendency, Perseveration-Tendenz. While the errors thus far discussed appeared sporadically in long series of correct responses, there might still be observed at times a massing of errors, usually at the beginning of a day of experimentation or at the beginning of a new series. We were regularly told that Hans always had to have time to adjust himself to new circumstances. The records often showed comments such as these: "After a number of practice tests, the horse appeared particularly well disposed," or "Hans, at first inattentive, does not respond. Suddenly he gets the hang of things." Different questioners who worked with the horse required different lengths of time to obtain proper responses. Some needed a quarter of an hour, others scarcely half a minute. I myself found that in the degree in which I learned to control my attention, in that degree did this phenomenon tend to disappear, but would reappear the moment I became indisposed. From this we see that, instead of attributing all sorts of mental characteristics, such as stubbornness, etc., to the horse, we should lay them to the account of the questioner. As a matter of fact, we find that this getting into the sweep of things, i.e. the overcoming of psychophysical inertia, has long been known in the case of man and has been experimentally determined and called Anregung, excitation, by the psychiatrist Kraepelin and his pupil Amberg. A massing of errors towards the end of a long series occurred only when the questioner was fatigued. There was nothing which had to be interpreted as fatigue or indisposition on the part of the horse, except in the few cases of very large numbers, compare page 67. To be sure, Mr. von Osten always offered these two excuses. That they were without warrant is shown by the fact that Hans, after appearing indisposed or fatigued while working with one questioner, would nevertheless react promptly and correctly a moment later for some other experimenter, and furthermore, when working with me, the number of his correct responses would rise or fall with my own mental disposition. Finally, I would here note a rather interesting observation for which I am indebted to Mr. Schillings and the Count zu Castell. They had noticed, independently of each other, that the horse would often fail to react when for any length of time he was given problems dealing with abstract numbers, even though they were of the simplest kind, but that he would immediately improve whenever the questions had to do with concrete objects. They believed that Hans found applied mathematics more interesting, and that abstract problems, or those which were altogether too elementary, bored him. The Count zu Castell furthermore noticed that the responses tended to be more correct as soon as he had the horse count objects which he, himself, Castell, could see during the test. Quite in accord with this is the statement to be found in the report of the September Commission, in which we find this note in a discussion of the arithmetical problems not involving visual objects, which the gentleman already mentioned had given to the horse. The horse responded with less and less attentiveness and appeared to play with the questioner. Here again that was looked for in the animal which should have been sought in the man. Mr. Shillings was capable of intense but not continued concentration, and it was he who was bored, not the horse. And it was the Count zu Castell and not the horse that found it necessary to invoke the aid of perceptual objects to bring his attention to the proper height of concentration. The reader will see that thus far I have supposed the horse to be a never-failing mechanism and have placed all errors to the account of the questioner. The horse never failed to note the signal for stopping, and therefore never was the immediate cause of an error. It is not to be denied that now and then he would cease tapping spontaneously, and in this way would become the cause of an error. We have no data on this point, but undoubtedly the horse's share in the total number of errors was very slight. B. Another source of error was faulty computation on the part of the questioner. The questioner made the signal for stopping when the expected number of taps had been reached. The horse faithfully mirrored the miscalculation of the questioner. I have knowledge of only one such case. The journals report that once Mr. von Osten, when someone called to his attention that Hans had indicated the wrong day of the week, replied, "Yes, you are right, it was not Thursday, but Friday," whereupon Hans, being asked again, promptly responded correctly. This appeared to the reporter in question as proof of the subjective influence of Mr. von Osten upon the horse. C. When errors in calculation and failures in proper concentration combine, i.e. when the questioner makes a mistake in calculation because he is excited or inattentive, and for the same reason does not make the movement, which is the signal for stopping, in accordance with the number which he deems to be the correct answer, then the result is usually wrong. But it may be correct in the few cases in which the two errors exactly compensate each other. Nothing has been so effective in establishing Hans's reputation, nothing has brought him so many followers as these cases in which he, rather than his mentor, has been in the right. Compared with the mass of cases in which Hans was wrong, these latter cases are diminishingly few in number. Yet these few made such an impression upon the observers that their number tended to be overestimated. As a matter of fact, I have been able to discover records of only 7 such cases. 2 of these were reported by the Count zu Castell. On the 8th of September he entered the horse's stall alone, and believing it to be the 7th day of the month, he asked Hans the date. The horse responded correctly with 8 taps. At another time he held up before Hans a slate on which were written the numbers 5, 8, and 3, and asked the horse to indicate their sum, which in the momentary excitement vaguely appeared to Castell to be 10. To his chagrin he noticed that Hans continued to tap. Thereupon he intentionally remained motionless until the horse had stopped tapping spontaneously, as he thought, at 16. The newspapers reported that the numbers to be added had been 5, 3, and 2, and that the questioner had expected the answer 11, but Hans had in 3 tests always ceased tapping at 10. In both cases the questioner regarded the answer of the horse as wrong and recognized his mistake when his attention was called to it. I myself had the same experience. One time I received in response to the question, "What day of the week is Monday?" the answer 2, although I had expected the answer 1. At another time I asked, "How much is 16 less 9?" and the horse responded with 7 taps, although I had erroneously expected 5. I noticed my mistake only when my attention was called to it by one of those present. Another example is related by Mr. Shillings. A row of coloured cloths lay before Hans. Besides them stood an army officer. Pointing to the latter's red coat, Mr. Shillings asked the horse to indicate, by means of tapping, the place in the row whereupon a piece of the same colour lay. Hans tapped 8 times, but Mr. Shillings reprimanded him because the red piece was, as a matter of fact, second in the row. Upon a repetition of the test, Hans again tapped 8. By some, the facts are recounted as having been the other way round, namely, Hans tapped 2 instead of 8. This, of course, would call for a different explanation. It was noticed that at the place which would be indicated by 8 taps, there was not a red piece but a carmine-coloured piece of cloth. A newspaper reports, somewhat vaguely, a 6th case as follows. Hans was asked to spell the name Donhoff, and began correctly D-O umlaut. Mr. von Osten, who somehow began to think of another name, Donher, interrupted him and wished to correct him by suggesting O instead of O umlaut, i.e. 2 taps instead of 3. Hans, however, continued to spell the entire word with great equanimity. He had not erred. A similar experience is reported by Mr. H. von Tepelaski, the well-known hippologist. Although the details have slipped from his memory, he reports that in the case in question the correct answer was thrice refused by the questioner, who thought that the horse's answer was incorrect. Hans, upon being severely reprimanded in a loud and harsh tone of voice, turned about as if disgusted with the injustice of the man and made straight for his stall. It was clear that in the cases described we are not dealing with accidentally correct responses, for in nearly every case the test was repeated a number of times and the same responses were received each time. As a matter of fact, my own introspection convinced me that the third and fourth cases were surely, and the first and sixth were very probably, due to insufficient concentration on the part of the questioner. Accordingly, there is everywhere in these cases a difference of +1 or +2 between the number thought of and the number tapped. See page 92F. The data in the second and fifth, and still more in the seventh case, were too meagre to warrant an attempt at explanation, for it is not even known whether Hans responded with more or fewer taps than was expected by the questioner. It is unfortunate that a more complete record was not made. The frequent and intentional attempts of Mr. von Osten to induce the horse to give an incorrect response, which, by the way, were regularly unsuccessful, belong only apparently to this group. Thus he asked, e.g., 2 times 2 is 5, is it not? 3 times 3 is 8, etc., but Hans refused to be misled and responded correctly. This was from the very beginning one of the main arguments for independent thinking on the part of the horse. The actual procedure was as follows. Even though the questioner had said 2 times 2 is 5, there was still present in his consciousness the number 4. I myself would think either of the first number of the equation, i.e. 2 times 2, in which case Hans would respond with 4 taps, or I would have in mind the second member, i.e. 5, in which case he would respond with 5 taps. Never did I succeed in thinking of both at the same time. The association between the thought 2 times 2 and the concept 4 is so close and supported by so many other associations that the attempt to form a new one that is at complete variance with all these is futile. One may say 2 times 2 equals 5, but it is impossible to conceive it. Let us turn now from the tests in counting and computation to those in reading. We have seen that Hans manifested his seeming knowledge of language symbols in a threefold manner. He might approach a slate on which was written the symbol asked for, or he would indicate its location in a series of slates by means of tapping, or finally by means of a so-called spelling of the word, which was written upon a slate or placard. These responses by means of approaching a placard were very often unsuccessful, while indications by means of tapping were scarcely ever unsuccessful. If it were true that higher intellectual processes... Footnote. Professor Shaler, a well-known American savant, mentions a 3-year-old pig belonging to a Virginian farmer that was able to read and had some understanding of language. From numerals which were written upon cards and spread out before it, this pig could compose dates. It could also select from among certain cards one upon which was written a given name asked for by the master. Supposedly no signs of any kind were given. Shaler thought to exclude effectively the sense of smell, which is so highly developed in the pig that he, Shaler, himself smelled at the cards, since he also possessed an acute olfactory sense. Since we are told that the farmer in question made a business of supplying trained pigs for exhibition purposes, the case appears suspicious. We hear of a pig exhibited in London that was able to read and spell, and could also tell the time by the watch. We cannot tell, however, whether the two pigs, which beyond a doubt were mechanically trained to respond to signals, were identical or not. End of footnote. Were here involved, then the converse would have to be expected, for tapping required not only the ability to read, but also the ability to count. If, on the other hand, we assume that the horse simply followed the directions given by the questioner's movements, this seeming difficulty resolves itself, for it would be more difficult for Hans to perceive the signs which he receives while moving than those which he receives while tapping. When we recall that it was easier to direct the horse to a placard near the end of a row than one nearer the centre, see page 81, we can readily understand how it was that during the experimentation carried on by the September Commission, supplement 3, page 255, Hans was able to point out immediately the placards on which were written the names Castell and Stumpf, for they were at the two extreme ends, but was unsuccessful in locating the one on which was written the name Meissner, which was not a bit more difficult to read, but was located at the fourth place in the row. He first approached the fifth card, then upon repetition of the test he pointed out the other neighbouring tablet, namely the third. In spelling, Hans was quite indifferent whether his table with the 84 number signs upon it stood before him, for he had no knowledge of letters. Neither Mr. von Osten nor Mr. Schillings required it, for the former knew the table by heart, and Mr. Schillings told me that before every test he made a note of the numbers which were necessary to indicate the required letters, trusting in this way to control the responses of the horse, never guessing that by doing so he was making it possible for the horse to answer correctly. The newspaper reports aroused much interest at the time by stating that Hans was able to spell such proper names as Pluskov and Bethmann-Hollweg, even to putting the difficult W and TH. The friends of Mr. von Osten at the same time called attention to the exquisite auditory acuteness of the horse, which enabled him to perceive the aspirated W and to discriminate between the TH and T. The TH is softer than the T in German, translator. This explanation, of course, must have appeared somewhat daring even at that time. Hans was quite guiltless on the many limitations imputed to him concerning his knowledge of symbols. That he was unable to read capitals or Latin script was merely a vagary of the master, like the belief that it was necessary to confine oneself in one's question to a certain vocabulary and to a certain form. Mr. von Osten's apparent failure to elicit responses from the horse on topics of which it was ignorant is a beautiful illustration of the power of imagination. Mr. von Osten was convinced from the very first that Hans could not answer such questions. When the belief in success was lacking, of course there was not the requisite amount of concentration which alone leads to perceptible expressive movements and thus elicits a successful reaction on the part of the horse. Mr. Schillings, owing to his great impressionability, remained long under the spell of Mr. von Osten's point of view. Thus, I find in the record of the September Commission that the question, "How much is 3 plus 2?" was answered incorrectly by Hans, but he responded correctly the moment Mr. Schillings replaced the word plus, which was tabooed, by the word and. For a long time he could receive no response to questions put in French, until one day he made the discovery that, curiously enough, the animal never responded adequately unless he himself firmly believed in the possibility of success. It is noteworthy that the Count zu Castell, independently of Mr. Schillings, made the same discovery. Mr. Schillings made his curious discovery, which he was unable to interpret, but which aroused some suspicion on the following occasion. One day, whether accidentally or because his prejudice was overcome, he commanded "Dis-dou." Hans responded promptly with 2 taps. He was greatly surprised and believed that Hans had gotten hold of the French by hearing it spoken in his environment. Possibly he understood 3 and 4. He put the questions and received correct responses. He asked again, 10, 20, and so on up to 60. At 66 he became doubtful. Indeed, Hans failed him. At 80 the game began again. 100 again succeeded. The old saying that faith will move mountains was verified once more. Footnotes. It has been scientifically proven that a number of supposed mystical phenomena, table moving, table rapping, and divination by means of the rod, are all the result of involuntary movements made unawares by those concerned, just as in the case of this work with Hans. We must of course accept those not infrequent instances in which the phenomena in question are purposely and fraudulently simulated. There is this difference, however, that there the thing affected is a lifeless object, the table or the rod. Here it is a living organism, the horse. Hence, there the immediate effect of the movement is physical work in the form of energy expended in moving the table. Here the movement becomes a visual stimulus. A number of observations which I find in the relevant literature, and which I shall introduce into this chapter, may serve to show how close is the similarity between the two cases, how much depends upon the questioner, and how little really upon the instrument, whether table or horse, which is acted upon. 2 examples will suffice to illustrate the significance of belief and of the concentrated attention that results from it. The first is taken from the letters of Father P. Lebrun on the divining rod, which appeared in 1696. An old woman once told a treasure seeker that she had always heard that a treasure was buried at a certain place in the fields. The man, who was known as an expert in the art of using the divining rod, immediately set out to locate the gold. Lo and behold, the moment he set foot on the spot described by the old woman, the branch turned downward, and from its movements the man gathers that 12 feet below ground there lies buried some copper, silver, and gold. He calls a peasant to dig a pit 11 feet deep, then he sends him away so that no other should get into the secret. He himself digs a foot deeper, but all in vain, for he finds nothing. Standing in the pit, he again takes up the branch. Again it moves, but this time it points upward, as if to indicate that the treasure had disappeared from the earth. Dismayed, he climbs out the pit and questions the branch a third time. This time it points downward once more. He climbs back into the pit. Presently he feels the prick of conscience, for in the 17th century many regarded the dipping of the divining rod as the work of the devil. Terrified, he exclaims, "O God, if the thing I am doing here is wrong, then I renounce the evil one and his rods. S'il y a du mal, je renonce au démon et à la baguette." Having spoken, he once more takes the rod in his hand to test it. It does not move. Horrified, for now there was no longer any doubt that Satan was the cause of its movements, the man makes the sign of the cross and runs away. But had he hardly gone more than 200 or 300 paces when the thought strikes him, is it really true that the branch will no longer move for him? He throws a coin to the ground, cuts a branch from a bush nearby, and is overjoyed when he notes how it dips towards the money. Another example is to be found in a report of the well-known physicist Ritter of Munich, which appeared during the early part of the 19th century. Ritter, a man with a bent for natural philosophy and metaphysics, describes an instrument which was to replace the divining rod, and which he called balancier. It was simple enough, consisting of a metal strip that was balanced horizontally upon a pivot, and was supposed to be put in motion in the presence of metals. Ritter used this instrument in his numerous experiments with the Italian Campetti, a man who had achieved a measure of fame in Europe for his ability to discover springs and metals by the use of the divining rod. Carrying the balancier on the tip of the middle finger of his left hand, Campetti, whose integrity one cannot cavil at, had to touch repeatedly a plate of zinc or pewter, and had to count aloud the number of touches he made. The following curious law was found to obtain, that was probably suggested to the subject by Ritter without his being aware of it. With the first contact, the balancier turns to the left, with the second to the right, and with the third it remains at rest. At 4 it turns once more to the left, at 5 to the right, at 6 it remains at rest, etc. It remained immovable only at the so-called triagonal numbers 3, 6, 9, 15, 21, etc. Ritter tells us that when Campetti did not really count, or did not think of the number, then it would have no influence whatever upon the action of the instrument. Thus Ritter ascribes to the agency of electricity, which in the 18th and 19th centuries was made to play very much the same role that Satan had played in the 16th and 17th centuries. The similarity of these two cases and that of Mr. Schilling's is evident. When the questioner of the horse and the bearers of the balancier and of the divining rod are confident of success, they succeed. When they do not expect success, they fail. End of footnotes. Hans's seeming knowledge of the value of coins and cards, of the calendar and the time of day, as well as his ability to recognize persons or their photographs, can now be readily understood. In all of these cases we had to deal, insofar as knowledge is concerned, only with that of the questioner. The horse simply tapped the number the questioner had in mind. The meaning which was supposed to be expressed by the tapping never existed as far as Hans was concerned. It was only in the mind of the questioner that the concepts ace, gold, Sunday, January were associated with 1, etc. The same was true with regard to all the other wonderful feats of memory. The sentence Brücke und Weg sind vom Feinde besetzt, the road and the bridge were held by the enemy, which was given to the horse one day and correctly repeated by him on the following day, was not an answer elicited from the horse by means of a question, but rather a system of automatic reactions which were induced by certain involuntary movements of the questioner as stimuli. Far from showing a wonderful memory in these feats, as is claimed for him by the very non-critical compiler Zell, Hans, on the contrary, has at his service a remarkably small number of associations. For besides possessing the ability of any ordinary horse, he recognizes only a few meagre visual signals. To be sure, we find in the literature a horse that was said to have recognized 1,500 signals, but all proof is lacking, and the report is so meagre that we cannot discover whether the signals were auditory or visual. Footnote: the French investigators Vachide and Rousseau made a reference to this case, and mistakenly state the number of signals as 1,500 instead of 115. Ettlinger takes over this wrong figure and makes the additional mistake of assuming that the reference is to an original investigation made by the two Frenchmen. End of footnotes. Having thus disposed of all questions concerning the horse's apparent feats of reason and memory, let us turn to those in the field of sensation. We shall begin with vision. That Hans was unable to select coloured pieces of cloth merely upon the basis of colour quality, without reference to their order, was shown in Chapter 2. It would, however, be somewhat hasty to infer colour blindness from this fact, as did Romanes on the basis of similar unsuccessful responses on the part of a chimpanzee, Sally of the London Zoological Garden. It is much easier to explain the failure of the horse than that of the monkey on the basis of intellectual poverty, a poverty of associative activity. It presumably can discriminate between the various colours, but it cannot associate with these their names. The existence of chromatic vision in the lower forms is by no means as unquestionable as is assumed by popular thought. Even teleological considerations which are often brought forward, especially that of the ornamental and protective colouring of so many animals, can never do more than establish a certain probability. For definite proof we need data given by observation. We have none in this case, or experimental evidence. Such evidence we have, but it is insufficient in quantity, and unfortunately most of it was obtained under inadequate experimental conditions. Footnotes: all told, there are hardly more than half-dozen experimental investigations of the colour sense in mammals, to speak only of these. 3 of them deserve a special mention. One, the work of an American, Kinnaman, on 2 rhesus monkeys. Then a brief but careful work by Himstedt and Nagel. These 2 investigators were able to determine that their trained poodle could distinguish red of any tone or shade from the other colours, and from Professor Nagel I learned that later the tests were extended and the same was shown to be true concerning the blue and the green. And finally there is an investigation which hitherto has been known only from a reference which Professor Dahl, the investigator, himself makes. The work is on a monkey, Cercopithecus chlorocebus griseoviridis desmeret. Professor Dahl has kindly allowed me to look over the records of the experiments. He intends to publish the monograph at a later date. All these investigators arrive at the conclusion that the animals tested by them possess colour sense. The monkey last mentioned shows one peculiarity. It was unable to distinguish a saturated blue from the black. It will require further tests to clear this up. End of footnotes. We know nothing regarding chromatic vision in the horse, though we have often had trained horses which apparently possessed colour discrimination. The earliest report of this kind I find in a work published in the year 1573. Here we find that a number of Germans exhibited 2 horses in Rome which could, upon request of their masters, point out those persons among the spectators who were wearing stockings of any designated colour. The passage "conoscevano I colori," they recognized the colours, proves nothing, and no one has ever heard, even in modern times, of a horse that actually knew colours. Nor did Hans possess anything like that high degree of visual acuity which had been attributed to him. He was supposed to be able to read easily at a distance small, almost illegible script, which we ourselves could decipher only with the greatest difficulty close at hand. It was supposed that he could distinguish 10 and 50 pfennig pieces whose faces had become worn beyond recognition for us. None of these accomplishments have stood the test. We have no reason to believe that Hans can see the objects about him more clearly than other horses, regarding whom one usually assumes that they receive only vague visual impressions. Horses do not as a rule seem to be near-sighted, as is often asserted by the layman, but rather somewhat far-sighted, or if we may believe Rigel, who tested some 600 horses, they probably have normal vision. But we are told that many horses, according to some authors all, have an innate imperfection which detracts considerably from the clarity of vision. This imperfection consists in an irregular formation of the sclerotic coat and of the lens of the eye. The two organs do not have the same refraction in all parts. As a result, objective points are not imaged as points upon the retina, hence the name astigmatism, i.e. without points for this disorder. The retinal image of the object is not only vague, but also distorted. Footnote: there is no justification for the widespread belief that the horse which on account of the greater size of his eye, more correctly on account of the greater focal distance, receives larger retinal images of objects than does the human eye, for that reason also sees objects larger than we do. Horses shying is often explained in this way. But the conclusion just mentioned is erroneous. The retinal image is not the perceptual image. It undergoes many transformations within the nervous system itself. End of footnotes. Many will doubt whether with such imperfect images an animal can react to directives so minute as we have asserted to be true in the case of Hans. In considering this question we must distinguish between the directives for pointing out colours and the directives for tapping and for head movements on the part of the horse. In pointing out and bringing forth pieces of coloured cloth, there is involved in the perception of an object at rest, namely, the direction of the questioner who is standing quietly, whereas in the case of responses by means of tapping, the stimulus is the horse's perception of the questioner's movements. Now, the construction of the horse's eye, as described above, is not favourable for the perception of objects, so-called acuity of vision. This may partly account for the slight success of the horse in those tests in which he was required to select a piece of cloth of a designated colour, insofar as these commands were not accompanied by calls or exhortations. Where human observers averaged 80% correct responses, page 135, Hans, under similar conditions, was successful in only 1/3 of the tests. In his errors, he was also wider of the mark than were the human observers. The object perceived, to be sure, is a large one, namely, the questioner, and he at close range. We must therefore consider, more specifically, what are the determining factors that make for success or failure of the response. First of all, the innocent questioner very often did not designate the direction with sufficient clearness. Furthermore, Hans presumably was not able to discriminate sufficiently between the direction of the experimenter''s eye and that of his head, which two directions did not always coincide. Finally, the horse's attention was often diverted, while he was running towards the piece indicated, by the other pieces lying to the right and to the left. And for this reason the addition of a single piece to the otherwise unchanged row of 5 pieces tended to decrease greatly the chances of success. End of section 7. Section 8. Chapter 5. Explanation of the Observations, Part 2. The case is different with the perception of the directive signs for tapping, for nodding, and shaking the head, etc., all of which require the perception of movements. This is not necessarily more difficult on account of the imperfect constitution of the tissues that serve for the refraction of light. Some authors even aver that this facilitates the perception of moving objects. This view was first advanced by the excellent ophthalmologist R. Berlin of Stuttgart. In arriving at this view, he was guided by the following considerations. The peculiar form of astigmatism of the lens of the horse's eye, which Berlin has described as Butzenscheibenförmig. Footnotes. Butzenscheiben are the small circular panes of green glass used in leaded windows in early days. They are high in the middle, hence the name Butze, a protuberance, with a number of concentric circles around the central elevation. Translator. End of footnote. because it appears in the form of a series of glossy concentric circles around the lens nucleus, has the property of enlarging the pathway, and with it the rapidity, of moving retinal images. If we take a speculum by means of which a view may be had of the interior of the eye, and fixate a definite point on the retina of the horse, and then make a slight movement of the head horizontally, we find that the point fixated moves, apparently at least, towards the border of the pupil. In a normally constructed eye, this seeming movement will be in a straight line, while in the eye of the horse, according to Berlin, its path is curved, and therefore longer. Berlin believes that the same thing which here occurs in the case of this merely apparent movement must also happen when an external moving object is imaged on the horse's retina. Its pathway too will be curved and therefore longer, so that if the head of Mr. von Osten moves past the animal's eye, then the image on the horse's retina will take a longer, more circuitous route than it would if the eye were not astigmatic. We cannot, however, immediately conclude from the fact that an objective movement is imaged as being greater in extent on the retina, that it will therefore be more readily perceived by much less than it will appear greater to the horse than would be the case if the lens were normally constructed. The visual percept is not immediately dependent upon the retinal processes, for between the two are interpolated complex, inaccessible nervous processes. Still, Berlin believes that he is justified in drawing this conclusion from a number of relevant considerations. Accepting it, he believes that it would be possible for the horse to perceive movements that for the human eye, which is not subject to this form of astigmatism, would lie below the thresholds. This theory, the simplicity of which certainly must make a strong appeal, has been adopted by a number of well-known investigators, Schleich, Königshofer. If we also could accept it, then Hans's phenomenal power of perceiving the movements of objects would be explained. But doubts arise which restrain us. Even if we were to accept Berlin's view in general, we should still come upon the following difficulties. In the first place, it is questionable whether the peculiar form of astigmatism mentioned is indeed as common as he supposes. Footnotes. Since no opportunity was given us to examine Hans's eyes, we do not know what their condition is in this respect. Though it would have been interesting to know, it would hardly make any difference in the views presented. If Hans should prove to be either far or near-sighted, then, if we are to make any supposition at all, it would be that the defect could not be very great, since near-sightedness exceeding 2 or 3 diopters and far-sightedness exceeding 1 diopter is seldom found in the case of the horse. According to Mr. von Osten, Hans at one time manifested a tendency to shy easily. Be this as it may, for little could be concluded from it, since in many extremely shy horses no kind of visual imperfection can be discovered. End of footnotes. The references in the literature are exceedingly meagre on this point. In order to make a few tests at least, I undertook to examine 9 horses with the aid of Dr. R. Simon, oculist, to whom I am greatly beholden for the assistance given in these and other tests to be mentioned presently. In not one of the 9 cases did we discover anything like the curved deflection which is supposed to be the sign of the form of astigmatism in question. But in order to test objectively whether Berlin's assumption were justified, we examined in the laboratory fresh specimens taken from 2 horses. The eyes were fastened in a frame in what corresponded to their normal position. Their posterior spherical wall, i.e. their respective retinal surface, was replaced by a piece of ground glass. On a spherical surface, linear movements of a point of light are always imaged as curves, no matter what the shape of the lens forming the image may be. For a more detailed statement, see page 170 at close of notes. Since, however, our investigation had to do only with those curves which were due to the qualities peculiar to the lens, we had to replace the spherical by a plane projection surface. In front of the eye thus modified, a strong light was placed at such a distance that the image of it, produced on the improvised back of the eye by the cornea and the lens, was a sharply defined point of light. Now, when the source of light was moved, the point of light would also move on the glass plate. Sitting at some distance behind the eye, we observed the movements of this point through a telescope. Thus we became witnesses of what happens upon the horse's retina when a moving object passes in front of his eye. Although we saw the point of light move through relatively long distances both horizontally and vertically, no sort of deflection in its pathway could be noted. Berlin's exposition does not hold true for the eyes of the horses, either living or dead, which were examined by us. But in the case of some of the horses in whom Berlin had seen the phenomenon for which we sought in vain, he himself tells us the deflection was very slight. In that case, it would appear, no great advantage would be gained along the lines indicated. But even assuming the degree of deflection to be very great, his theory goes to pieces on the very point it was supposed to explain. A concrete example will make this clear. If Mr. von Osten, standing 2 feet away from the horse, raised his head 1/5 of a millimetre, which figure by no means represents the extreme values that were obtained, then in the horse's retinal image every point of the man's head would move through a distance of 0.0025 millimetre, assuming the horse's eye to be free from astigmatism and assuming its focal depth to be 25.5 millimetres. If, however, other conditions remaining the same, we presuppose an extreme form of astigmatism, one in which the path of the retinal image is not a straight line, but is deflected into a semicircle, then each point would pass through a distance of nearly 0.004 millimetre. If the sensitive retinal elements have a diameter of 0.002 millimetre, as Berlin somewhat inexactly states, then from 2 to 4 elements would be stimulated in case there were no astigmatic deflection. But in case the deflection did take place, it would not necessarily involve more elements, as can be seen by making a simple graph. Indeed, we can imagine cases in which the circuitous path would involve even fewer elements than the straight one. And finally, when the movement which the horse is to perceive does not occur in a straight line, but in the form of a curve, which will generally be the rule, then the astigmatism will tend in many cases to decrease the curvature of the image's path on the retina, and sometimes even obviate it entirely. In all these cases, on Berlin's own theory, the perception of the movements would be hindered rather than aided. Footnote. For the benefit of specialists, I would say the following in addition to the more general remarks just made. For the most part, the determinations of refraction made on the eye of the horse are still rather unreliable. In skioscopy there is a dispute among investigators concerning ambiguous shadows, and in the use of the refraction ophthalmoscope no definitive region of the eye's background has been adhered to by the various investigators. It appears that Rigel, whose diligent researches mentioned on page 164 were published in 1904, knew nothing concerning the round area in the horse's eye, discovered by Eisern in 1902. Also, if so great a degree of astigmatism is really the rule as is emphasized especially by Hirschberg and Berlin, then the simple refractive index usually given, sometimes within a half diopter, would be meaningless. Berlin and Bayer believe the vagueness of the retinal image resulting from the astigmatism is offset by this, that the oval pupil functions as a stenopoeic slit. In view of the width of the horse's pupil, this appears to me to be rather hypothetical. Concerning Berlin's theory of deflecting astigmatism, I would say the following. Of the 2 ophthalmoscopic signs mentioned as being characteristic of this form of astigmatism, the concentric circles and the arcuate deflection of the pathway of the fixated points, when there is a movement of the eye of the observer, or of the eye observed, according to Berlin, the former is not so constant as the latter. So far as I know, the concentric ring formation is mentioned only by Bayer and Rigel, and is said to occur principally in horses with myopic vision, and hence, relatively, in a minority of cases. Judging from the particulars, we are inclined to believe that a case of Butzenscheiben lens reported by Schwendemann is in reality a case of senile sclerosis. Berlin repeatedly warns us against mistaking the one for the other. The arcuate deflection, on the other hand, has not been mentioned elsewhere as a personal observation. In Berlin's calculation of the increase in the extent of the retinal pathway, an ambiguity has crept in. He says that in the astigmatic eye there are stimulated 207 times as many nervous elements as would be stimulated in the ideally normal eye. It ought to read 207 more instead of 207 times as many, and this number holds only for the one case computed by Berlin, and under the specific assumption that exactly pi over 2 times the normal number of elements were stimulated, 571 instead of 364. Therefore, the general statement which Bayer makes in his textbook, that according to Berlin's evaluation 207 times more nervous elements are stimulated in the astigmatic eye than in the non-astigmatic one, does not hold true. Closing this note, a few remarks concerning the experiments made by Dr. Simon and myself. All of the 9 horses were tested for the vertical image by means of the ophthalmoscope. In most cases, Wolff's electric speculum was used. Atropine was not employed. For the laboratory tests, the adipose and the muscular tissues were removed from the eyeball and the rear part of the bulb cut away. The front part, containing the cornea and the lens, was fastened over one opening of a metal cylinder which was closed at the other end by means of a disc of ground glass. The hole, approximately as long as a horse's eye, was filled with a normal salt solution whose refractive index, 1.336, corresponds quite closely with that of the vitreous humour of the horse's eye. The pressure from within was regulated so that on the one hand it was not dimmed, and yet on the other there were no wrinkles in the cornea. The source of light, the filament of a Nernst lamp, was moved about in a plane 120 centimetres distant from the eye, and perpendicular to the optic axis. It was moved through the point of intersection as well as at various distances from it. Movement in horizontal and vertical directions was in each case along lines 150 centimetres in length, which would correspond to an angle of vision of not less than 64 degrees. The pathway of the imaged point was controlled by means of the crosshair of the telescope. If in the same way we observe through the sclerotic of an intact eyeball, the point of light falling upon the retina and shining through the sclerotic and choroid, which is not difficult when we use an intense light, then to the observer its pathway will, of course, appear to be deflected convexly towards the periphery, and the deflection will appear the greater the farther the point of light is removed from the optic axis. End of footnotes. But to come now to the most pertinent objection, we saw that Berlin's whole train of thought rested upon the assertion that it made no difference whether we regarded by means of the speculum the seeming movement of a fixed retinal point, or whether the image of an external moving object is passing over the horse's retina. As a matter of fact, however, these two processes are very different from one another. In moving the mirror with its small opening, we are looking through ever-changing portions of the horse's lens, testing it out, as it were. The horse, on the other hand, sees with all parts of the lens simultaneously, insofar as the lens is not covered by the iris. The arcuate deflection, which is nothing but a registration of the difference in the indices of refraction of the different parts of the lens used consecutively, might thus be formed for the observer using the mirror, but never for the horse. For these reasons we cannot conclude that the kind of astigmatism described can really increase the horse's acuity in the perception of movements. Since the light refracting apparatus of the horse's eye does not offer a satisfactory explanation for the extraordinary keenness of visual perception possessed by the Osten horse, we must go a step further and ask whether it may not perhaps be found in the part immediately sensitive to light, the retina. That portion really would seem to be adapted to the perception of movements of minimal extent, and for this reason it is more than 3 times as great in extent as the human retina, and the horse's retinal images are likewise larger owing to the position of the nodal point. The cells of the retina that are sensitive to light, the rods and cones, might therefore be correspondingly larger than those of the human eye, without thereby making the whole organ less efficient than the human eye. But the most recent measurements have shown that the rods and cones of the horse's eye are more minute than ours, assuming that, in the case of the horse, as is presumably the case in human vision, the transition of a stimulus from one retinal cell to the next already in itself induces a sensation of movement, then the horse ought to be extraordinarily keen in the perception of moving objects, provided that the horse's more minute cells are packed just as closely as in the human retina. and besides, there are two specially adapted areas within the retina of the horse. The band, streifenförmige area, which was discovered 15 years ago by Chayvitz, is a strip of 1 to 1.5 millimeters in width, transversing the entire retina horizontally, and is noteworthy on account of its structure and probably too on account of its greater efficiency. It may have something to do with the accomplishments of the Osten horse, but in how far it would be hard to say. The other noteworthy position of the horse's retina is the round area, discovered some 4 years ago, located at the rear outer end of the band, and it is the best equipped part of the horse's retina and corresponds to the area of clearest vision, the yellow spot, in the human eye. But this round area need not come in for consideration by us, for its location would indicate that it is used in binocular vision, that is, seeing with both eyes. But in all our experiments the Osten horse observed with only one eye. That does not mean, however, that under other circumstances the round area may not be of very great importance. In the present state of our knowledge, all attempts at explanation are, of course, of the nature of hypotheses. If further investigations should disclose this explanation to be untenable, then we would either have to suppose some unknown power in the eye of the horse. Footnotes. Königshofer, who, as we have already said, seconds the explanation given by the ophthalmologist Berlin, and who confounds Butzenscheiben astigmatism with the common so-called regular form, believes that not only astigmatism but also the shape of the blind spot of the eye must be taken into consideration. This portion of the retina, where the fibres of the optic nerve enter the eye, and called blind spot because there are no cells there that are sensitive to light, is very nearly circular in man, but differs in shape in the different species of animal. Königshofer thought he had discovered that a relatively elongated blind spot was favourable to keenness of vision. If we place the mammalia in series on the basis of their relative keenness of vision, he says, we would find that this series is identical with the one in which they are grouped with reference to the form of the blind spot from the circular up to the most elongated. In such a series the marmot takes the place of honour. This exposition is not very satisfactory, however. We cannot be sure what he means by keenness of vision, Scharfäugigkeit. Is it visual acuity in the usual sense of the term, as is said in one of his passages, or keenness in the perception of the movement of objects? This would appear to be his real meaning, or both at the same time. But whatever the significance he may put into the term, any such attempts at grouping the lower forms must prove unsatisfactory from the very start on account of the scant data which we possess on visual perception in animals. The experiences of the hunt upon which Königshofer partly bases his views are entirely inadequate for such a purpose. This much is certain, that the Osten horse, in spite of a blind spot which, though somewhat oval, is by no means very elongated, possesses an extraordinary acuity in the perception of movements. Even if the parallelism mentioned by Königshofer were really shown to exist, it would not explain the matter until it were also shown in what way keenness of vision is dependent upon the shape of the blind spot, a portion of the eye which is not immediately operative in the visual sensation at all. End of footnotes. Or else seek a cause in the animal's brain. Further experiments on other horses would be necessary in order to discover whether the species as a whole possesses this ability or whether only certain ones are thus endowed. The former is of course more probable. In this particular case, conditions were unusually favourable for the development of this ability. We must bear in mind that in all probability Mr. von Osten's movements very gradually became as minute as they are now, and that therefore Hans at first learned to react to such as were relatively coarse. Furthermore, his practice extended throughout 4 years, and during this time it was his sole occupation. Without specific predisposition, however, all this practice would have been utterly futile. We can also readily appreciate how indispensable in the struggle for existence a well-developed power of perceiving moving objects must be to horses, and most other animals, living in their natural condition and habitat, in order to be aware of the approach of enemies, or in the case of carnivora, the presence of prey. In view of all these considerations, we can readily see how it was possible that the horse, perhaps in spite of rather defective vision, could react with precision to movement stimuli which escaped observation by human eyes. We can understand also the horse's never flagging attentiveness when we recall that self-preservation prompts eternal vigilance over against all that is going on in the animal's environment. In the case of Hans, hunger was at first the motive, later habit did the work. Furthermore, the lower form is not hindered in giving itself over to its sense impressions by the play of abstract thought which tends so strongly to direct inward our psychic energy, at least in the case of the cultured. Nevertheless, Hans still remains a phenomenon, not only in excelling all his critics in the power of observation, but also in that he is the first of his species, in fact the first animal, in which this extraordinary perceptual power has been proved experimentally to be present. It has long been known that horses could be trained to respond to cues in the form of slight movements, which remained unnoticed by the layman, and this fact has been made use of by circus trainers to its fullest extent. But such signs, I have discovered, are without exception of a far coarser sort than those which we have here described, and they can be instantly detected by the practised observer. Nor was it known to professional trainers that it was possible for the master to direct a horse to any point of the compass simply by means of the quiet posture of the body. For this reason it was believed that no signs could possibly be involved in the colour selecting tests. Compare Supplement 3, page 255. In this we have the support of some of our experts, as is witnessed by the following extract from a letter of His Excellency Count G. Lendorf, one of the best hippological authorities, who at one time carefully examined the Osten horse. The letter was addressed to Mr. Schillings, and I have permission of both gentlemen to use it. In it he says, if the author's statements, in which you also have concurred, are correct, and if, as a matter of fact, the horse really does react to such minute movements as are absolutely imperceptible to the human observer, then we have indeed something quite new. Hitherto no one would have believed that horses can perceive movements which man cannot. But I am even more surprised by the explanation of the colour selecting feats. This too is something absolutely new, and one would not have deemed it possible that a horse could do anything of the kind simply by using the posture of a man's body as a cue to which it could react with such precision. And yet, even though both facts were new concerning the horse, and had not hitherto been proven experimentally regarding any other species, nevertheless something of this sort has been known concerning the dog for some time. His ability to single out an object upon which his master had intently fixed his gaze was made the basis of a special form of training called eye training nearly 100 years ago. The dog was taught to focus constantly upon his master's eyes, and then upon command to select the object which he, the master, had been fixating. Such a dog has been described by the naturalists A. and K. Müller. But the master of the dog, unlike Mr. von Osten, would not permit anyone else to work with the animal, and the two brothers, recognizing the trick, were justified in adding that the whole affair aimed at deceiving the public, and the horse's reputation was but a means of making money. The success of such exhibitions appeared furthermore to depend upon the close proximity of the trainer and the dog, whereas the direction of the head, and even of the body, could very probably be perceived at greater distances also. At least we learn from a reputable source that in the hunt dogs can perceive from the mere posture of their master what direction he intends to take. But a still more curious fact is this, that dogs too learn, evidently spontaneously, to react to the minimal involuntary expressive movements of their master. The first example mentioned in the literature on the subject is that of an English bulldog called Kepler, belonging to the English astronomer Sir William Huggins. We are told that this dog seemingly could solve the most difficult problems, such as extracting square roots and the like. The numbers were indicated by barking. Thus, 1 bark was for 1, 2 barks for 2, etc. Every correct solution was rewarded with a piece of cake. Huggins states explicitly that he gave no signals voluntarily, but that he was convinced that the dog could see from the questioner's face when he must cease barking, for he would never for an instant divert his gaze during the process. Huggins was unable, however, to discover the nature of the effective signs. This satisfactory, though still unproven, explanation has been accepted by specialists, among them Sir John Lubbock. I, too, regard this dog as a predecessor of our Hans. A similar case is reported by Mr. Hugo Kretschmer, a writer of Breslau, in the Schlesische Zeitung of August 21, 1904. To him I am beholden for a detailed written statement, which he has kindly permitted me to use in this connection. The gentleman named first trained his dog to ring the table bell, and this by pressing the dog's paw upon the bell button. When the dog had learned to do this independently, his master tried to teach him the rudiments of numbers in such a way that the animal was to give one ring of the bell for the number 1, 2 for 2, etc., but these attempts failed utterly and had to be abandoned. But Mr. Kretschmer had noticed that he was able to get the dog to ring any number which he, Mr. Kretschmer, might decide upon. Success was always rewarded by a bit of bread and butter. At first, Mr. Kretschmer tried to imagine vividly only the final number, but failed thereby to elicit correct responses from the dog. But he did succeed when he tried making a series of separate volitions. Thus, for the number 5, he would will each separate push of the button on the part of the dog. Even so, however, he never got beyond 9, for then the dog would become impatient and would ring the bell continuously. Anything that diverted the dog's attention, such as noises, etc., also entailed failure. In these tests, master and dog had faced each other, each gazing steadfastly at the other. Mr. Kretschmer was convinced, however, that the dog was not guided by any sort of sign, but rather by suggestion. He based his belief on the following 2 observations. After some practice, he says, the tests were also successful when he did not look at the dog, but stood back to back with it, or when he screened himself from the dog's view by stepping to one side behind a curtain. The tests were unsuccessful, on the other hand, whenever he was mentally fatigued or had taken some alcoholic drink. The arguments do not appear to me to be adequate. If he turned his back upon the dog and no other observer was present, he had no means of knowing whether the dog did not, after all, peer around to get a peep at him. If others who knew the desired number were present, the dog might have gotten his cues from them, and there may be some doubt whether the curtain adequately served the purpose for which it was intended. At any rate, it was added that all attempts to influence the dog from an adjoining room, which would thus exclude effectively all visual signs, were utter failures. I am also strengthened rather than weakened in my belief by the second argument which Mr. Kretschmer makes, namely, that mental fatigue or the use of alcohol on the part of the questioner tends to make the result unsatisfactory. We noted a similar effect in the case of the horse, where a disturbance of the rapport between the questioner and the horse was invoked by some by way of explanation. The facts were explained by us much more simply. We attributed the result to the close correlation between the type of mental concentration and the nature of the expressive movements, a correlation which we have shown experimentally to exist. I cannot, therefore, subscribe to the view that this dog did not require either visual or other sensory signs. The tests which were made for the purpose of strengthening that view are on a par, I believe, with those mentioned on page 45. And since auditory, olfactory, and other stimuli, though not impossible, still are improbable, I believe that our Hans Huggins's dog and the one belonging to Mr. Kretschmer differ from one another only in this, that the first taps, the second barks, and the third presses a bell button. And finally, I have access to a letter from the Rahn province, in which there is a brief account of a dog that would promptly obey any command that was given without a sound, and supposedly without the accompaniment of the slightest kind of gesture. It is specially mentioned that the animal steadily watched its master during these tests. The perception of the slightest involuntary expressive movements is in all probability the secret in this case also. Here, too, suggestion has been invoked by way of explanation, but there was not the slightest attempt made to find for it a more specific foundation, and we cannot suppress an objection based upon the matter of principle. It is incumbent upon anyone who uses a term so ambiguous to define what content he desires to have put into it. If he does not do this, he is giving us, instead of a concept, a bare word, instead of bread, a stone. While we must reject the explanation based on suggestion, footnote, I can find examples of supposed suggestion in the case of animals given only by Rouhet. He says that by means of suggestion he taught a half-year-old, half-blooded mare colt, which he had raised himself, to fetch and carry, and this in a very short time. In order to indicate to the colt what was wanted, Rouhet would concentrate with his whole mind upon the object intended, a watch, and at the same time he would bend forward slightly. In the third test, that is at the end of 15 minutes, he had accomplished his purpose, and in the 10th lesson, no more mistakes occurred. The colt would fail to respond, however, as soon as he refrained from making any gestures, or was in a laissez-faire frame of mind, or when he thought of other things. He therefore believes that there must have been some kind of immediate, though inexplicable, connection between the brain of the trainer and that of the horse. I think the explanation is evident. The connection was not, as he thought, an immediate one, but arising through the mediation of the man's attitude un peu baissée, and of his movements, gestes, both resulting from his intense concentration, tension de la pensée. In general, we may say that, no matter what content we may wish to put into the term suggestion, not a single fact has come to light which would justify, and much less demand, the application of the term to lower forms, unless we would expand the definition of the term to the extent of comprising every kind of command, every arousal of ideas whatsoever. But it would then be nothing but a new name for old knowledge, and would lose all explanatory power. Hypnotism, so called, in the case of horses, I shall discuss elsewhere in another connection. End of footnotes. We believe, on the other hand, that we have here again evidence of the presence of visual signs given unwittingly and involuntarily, just as I am sure they were involved in the two preceding cases, and similarly in the case of the Huggins dog. Since the effective signs were discoverable in none of these canine predecessors of Hans, an investigation would be desirable based upon the insight gained as a result of these experiments upon Mr. von Osten's horse. Unfortunately, this is impossible since the dogs in question are dead, but others like them undoubtedly exist in many places. We might mention that when Hans first came under the limelight of public attention, there was also frequent reference to the Huggins dog, but he soon dropped out of the discussion again. And this is for two reasons. The dog never took his gaze from his master and appeared to be entirely dependent upon him in his reactions. Hans, on the other hand, seemed to give evidence of a high degree of independence and never appeared to look at the questioner. But we know now that, though he was never dependent upon the will of his master, he, too, abjectly hung upon the man's involuntary movements and never for a moment lost him from view. But since the horse is able to observe with one eye alone, and needed to direct only it and not the entire head towards the questioner, in order to focus comfortably, one could not conclude as to his line of vision from the direction of the head. Since, furthermore, in the horse the pupil is hardly distinguished from the darkly pigmented iris, and since the white sclerotic is hidden by the eyelids, except when the eye is turned very much, it is difficult to determine what direction the eye is taking. I once purposely stepped backwards to the horse's flank, so that he had to turn his eye far back, and thus the outer border of the iris and the white sclerotic coat became visible, and all doubt concerning the line of vision was removed. This doubt could never arise in the case of the dog, the median plane of whose head is always directed towards the object fixated, and Zorbzil is justified in saying, as he does, in his discussion of training of the kind mentioned on page 177, but any careful observer can immediately guess the manner in which such a dog has been trained. If Hans had chanced to possess so-called glass eyes, in which the dark pigment is wholly or partly lacking, so that the black pupil is clearly defined against the lighter background, then no doubt could ever have arisen concerning the direction of the eye, and Hans never would have become regarded as the clever Hans. After the publication of the December report, Hans acquired a reputation for the excellence in thought reading, and thus the discussion of thought reading among animals in general became once more the order of the day. That is to say that many of our domestic animals are, like the human mind reader, à la Cumberland, supposed to have the ability to infer the thoughts of their masters from slight involuntary movements. They are thus aware when the feeding hour approaches, when they may go out in the open, etc. They also appear to be aware that their welfare lies in our hands, and therefore would seem to have a vital interest in divining our intentions and our wishes. not only our spoken words, but our numberless movements, usually without our knowing it, and often contrary to our desire, speak a clear language. As is well said by the American neuropathologist Beard, who first explained the phenomenon of thought reading on the basis of the perception of very minute muscular jerks, and therefore called it muscle reading or body reading, every horse that is good for anything is a muscle reader. He reads the mind of his driver through the pressure on the bit, though not a word of command is uttered. We know that in the case of perfectly trained horses, the rider's mere thought of the movement which he expects the horse to make is seemingly sufficient to cause the animal to execute it. Footnote. An illustration is given by Babinet concerning the horse of an English lord. Mr. Burkhardt Foote, also that excellent trainer, who has been master of more than 40 of the most highly trained horses, tells us that while sitting on a well-managed horse, it sometimes happened that he had merely thought of making a certain turn, when the horse immediately executed, before he, the rider, had to his knowledge given any sign or aid. An observation belonging under this head is also made in Tolstoy's Anna Karenina, this perfect mind of acute psychological observation. In the famous description of the race we are told concerning Count Vronsky riding his frou-frou just behind Machutin mounted upon Gladiator, who was leading the race. At the very moment when Vronsky thought that it was time to overtake Machutin, Frou-Frou, divining her master's thought, increased her pace considerably, and this without any incitement on his part. She began to come nearer to Gladiator from the more favourable, the near side. But Machutin would not give it up. Vronsky was just considering that he might get past by making the larger circuit on the off-side, when Frou-Frou was already changing direction and began to pass Gladiator on that side. Similar experiences might be gathered elsewhere. Not infrequently the reflection of the rider that his horse had not for a long time indulged in some trick peculiar to him will immediately call it forth, or doubts on the part of the rider concerning the possibility of crossing some barrier are often the cause of the horse's fall, or of his refusal to leap and of his running away. End of footnotes. Such cases are, of course, very much like that of our hands, excepting that instead of visual signs they involve aids of a mechanical nature, which, however, do not alter the general principle, since both of them are of the nature of sensory stimulation. But we must not overlook the essential difference between this so-called thought reading on the part of animals and that which is done by man. The human thought reader can interpret movements, for he is familiar with the ideas which are their source. Thus, when at the second tap I noticed a very slight jerk on the subject's head, and a stronger one at the fifth tap, I infer that he thought of the problem 2 + 3 = 5. While the experimenter thus cannot be said to read thoughts, he still infers them. The animal, on the other hand, we may be reasonably sure draws no such inferences. In its conscious life it remains ever on the sensory level. If we could ask Hans about it, he would probably answer, "As soon as my master stoops forward, I begin to tap. As soon as he moves, I stop. The thing which induces me to act thus is the carrot which is given me. What it is that induces my master to make his movements, I do not know." It is therefore erroneous to believe that animals require the power of abstract thinking in order to utilize the signs which are consciously or unconsciously given to them, as is argued by Goldbeck when he says with reference to the training for visual signs, which we have mentioned before, there the dog has consciously interpreted the visual impression in terms of the conclusion that he is expected to bring forth the leaf indicated. Nor was there any justification for the critic who thought he could put the essence of the report of December, given in Supplement 4, in the following words: he, Hans, showed that he has the power of attention, can draw logical conclusions, and can communicate the result of his thinking, and all this independently. Yet none of this had been asserted. The whole thing may be explained satisfactorily by means of a process of simple association established between the signs observed in the master and certain reactions on the part of the horse. The fact that the movements made were so exquisitely minute does not change the matter in the least. Such signs call for a high degree of sensory keenness and great concentration of attention, but by no means an extremely high intelligence. Let us turn now from the consideration of visual perception to that of auditory perception in the horse. We saw that the fact that Hans was able to respond to commands which were only inwardly enunciated, that is, commands which were merely thought of but not spoken, was not proof of great acuity of hearing, but rather that hearing was not at all involved. If Hans had been deaf, he would, nonetheless, have promptly obeyed the commands. Blind and nearsighted horses try to overcome their deficiencies by means of the sense of hearing, and hence show a pronounced play of ears. In the case of the Osten horse, however, attention has been diverted from auditory stimuli in the process of habituation to visual signs, and as a result ear movements are almost completely wanting. One is not, of course, permitted to deny a priori that perhaps some associations might have been formed between objects and the vocal signs belonging to them, e.g., between the coloured cloths and the names of the cloths if both had been presented together oftener than was the case. But there is a dearth of reliable observation as to how far auditory associations of this sort may be established in horses. Usually the following is cited. Horses learn to start off, to stop, and to turn about in response to calls. They are able to distinguish properly between the expressions right and left, or equivalent terms. Upon commands they will start to walk, to trot, or to run, and they also know the name by which they are usually called. All authors agree that cavalry horses understand the common military commands. One writer even avers that they excel the recruits in this respect. Some believe that in riding schools the horses pay closer heed to the calls of the riding master than to the control of the unpractised riders, even when the two are at variance with one another. My experience with the Osten horse and a number of other pertinent observations aroused in me the suspicion that much that is called or spoken in the process of managing a horse may possibly be just so much labour lost. In consequence, I made a series of relevant experiments. I have thus far tested 25 horses of different kinds, from the imported Arabian and English full-bloods down to the heavy draft horse. The experiments were made partly in the courtyard of military barracks, partly in the circus, and partly in a riding school or in private stalls. I am specially indebted for kind assistance to Messrs. von Lucanus, Busch, and to H. Burkhardt Footed and E. Schumann, the two excellent trainers connected with the Busch circus. During these tests, the horses were always amid circumstances familiar to them, whether free or bridled, under a rider or hitched to a wagon. All aids or signals, except the calls, were eliminated insofar as it was possible. The results of those tests were in substance as follows. Many horses react to a smack of the lips by a rather fast trot. Many stop on the cry holla or brr. This last was nicely illustrated in the case of two carriage horses supplied with large blinders and held with a loose rein and hitched to a landau. One of them regularly stopped when the brr was given by the driver, whereas the other, which had not been habituated to this signal, kept serenely on the trot, so that the vehicle regularly veered off the track, a sure sign that no unintentional aid was being given by means of the reins. Other horses, again, were accustomed to halt in response to the long-drawn-out holla, but it was the cadence of the melody rather than the word that was effective, since any other word, or even a series of inarticulate sounds, would produce the same result, provided they were given with the proper inflection. When this was changed, then the response would fail. The result was not so apparent when it came to controlling the kinds of gait. One riding school horse, when lunged and in a gallop, could be induced by a friendly call, the word again was a matter of inconsequence, to slacken his pace into a trot, and from a trot into a walk. But this reaction was by no means very precise. Another, a full-blood, contrary to the trainer's expectation, and to his great astonishment, failed to respond to any kind of spoken command as soon as the one who carried the reins refrained from making any movements which might indicate what was wanted. To refrain from all expressive movements of this kind is by no means an easy matter. The slightest move, apart from any help by means of the rein or the whip handle, was sufficient to evoke a response. The results in the case of the military horses differed in many particulars. Thanks to the courtesy of Captain von Lucanus, I had the opportunity of testing 3 cavalry horses, 2 geldings and 1 mare, aged 9, 13 and 19 years respectively, and all of them in the regiment ever since their 4th year. They had been selected as the most intelligent of the squadron, and we were assured that they would obey punctiliously all the usual commands. They were ranged behind one another with the customary distance of 2 horses' lengths between, and were ridden each by his accustomed rider. Both starting and stopping upon command were tested. The horses were held by the reins, but the riders were cautioned to refrain from giving any aid that might cause the horse to start when starting was to be tested, or that might restrain him when stopping in response to the spoken command was to be tested. If a suspicion arose, a thing which happened only twice, however, that a rider had actively aided in his horse's reaction, then an officer would mount into the saddle. If it appeared that one of the horses was simply imitating the others, then the others were purposely restrained by their respective riders. The commands were given by the corporal, who usually had charge of the horses. In a few cases the sergeant of the squadron gave the commands, but this made no difference in the success of the experiment. Now as to the results. Whenever the horses were trotting or walking, all commands without exception were in vain. They effected neither an increase nor a decrease in the pace. A result was obtained only when the horses were standing when the test began, and this result was simple enough. Upon certain calls the animals would respond by beginning to walk. This was the only reaction that was obtained. The most effective of the commands appeared to be squadron, march, but the commands squadron or march alone were quite as effective, yet none of these commands were obeyed without exception. Reactions were occasionally obtained in response to trot, gallop, retreat. The usual introductory squadron was purposely omitted here because it alone sufficed to start the horses, but the reactions were always the same, namely to start on a walk. Another series of commands, such as those which were addressed to the rider alone, e.g. lances down, had no effect whatever. A certain amount of selection therefore did seem to take place. In all these tests, the order of the horses with reference to each other's position was repeatedly changed. One of the horses, the youngest and reputed to be the most intelligent, he was a matter of fact the most spirited, gave evidence of a gregarious instinct, intensified by habit, which, if it had been overlooked, might have become a source of serious error. Not being accustomed to go at the head, when so placed it started promptly in only 18% of such cases. When, however, other conditions remaining the same, he was put in the second or third place, he started properly in 67% of the tests. And if we take into account only those cases in which the 3 most effective commands were used, squadron, march, and squadron, march, he reacted correctly in 91% of the cases. The numbers of tests were 17, 36, and 22 respectively for the 3 groups mentioned. The horse, therefore, almost always began to step properly when he stood behind one of his companions, but seldom when he stood at the head. And when he stood at the head and began to walk at the proper moment, it was plain that it was a case of imitation and not initiative, for the horse was still able to see the others, owing to the extent of his field of vision backwards, and he was always the last to move, whereas otherwise he was always the first to move, and always difficult to restrain. So when the horses to the rear were restrained, or when the intervening distance of 2 horses' lengths was lessened, so that this gelding could not see the one in the rear, he failed completely to respond. Accordingly, these 3 horses did little to justify the faith which the squadron had placed in them. End of section 8.